Close your eyes for a moment and imagine a city that never truly sleeps. Not in the modern sense of electric lights and humming machinery, but in the older, raw sense, a place where the tide dictates the schedule, where men haul rope and roll barrels before the sun clears the rooftops, where the smell of tar and fish and river mud seeps into the walls of every building within a mile of the water. This is Bristol, England, in the last decades of the 17th century, second only to London in the sheer volume of ships working its quays. Bristol was less a city than a machine, a vast, grinding mechanism for turning ocean voyages into profit. Tobacco from Virginia arrived in great hogsheads, rolling heavy along the cobblestones. Sugar from the West Indies sweetened the air near the refineries on the eastern bank. Wine from Portugal moved in oak casks stacked high on the shoulders of dock workers who sang and cursed in equal measure, and African goods carried under the increasingly regulated but still brutally active triangular trade routes passed through these waters with a regularity that spoke of empire rather than adventure. The River Avon curved through the city's heart, opening at its western mouth onto the Severn estuary and then the wider Atlantic beyond. For a boy born near this river sometime around the year 1680, the horizon was never an abstraction. It was simply the direction water flowed. That boy was Edward Teach, and almost nothing about his earliest years was recorded with any precision. No parish register has survived bearing his exact birth date. No family Bible lists his mother's maiden name with confidence. This was not unusual. Families of modest means in port cities kept their records in memory rather than ink. And memory is the first thing lost to time. What historians and researchers have pieced together suggests a father who worked the waterfront in some capacity, perhaps a minor mariner who made coastal runs to Plymouth and Liverpool, perhaps a shipwright who hammered timber frames for the hulls that crowded the dock. His mother kept a household together with the particular toughness that waterfront life demanded, stretching every penny and every scrap of salted meat through the lean months when the weather kept ships in port and wages stopped arriving. Edward likely grew up as one of several children in a home where the smell of the harbour drifted through every window and every conversation sooner or later turned to ships. The neighbourhood around the Bristol quays was a world unto itself, narrow cobbled streets where timber-framed houses leaned toward each other overhead, their upper stories nearly touching, while the ground floors housed chandlers, sailmakers, coopers, and tavern keepers whose doors were never fully closed. Boys like Edward existed at the edge of this economy, too young for the ships, too old to stay entirely out of the way. What the harbour offered instead was an education that no school could replicate. By his early teens, Edward was spending long hours on the quays. He carried messages between captains and merchants who had no patience for delays. He ran errands for ship's cooks who needed pepper or oakum or a fresh block of salt. He helped load barrels when extra hands were wanted, and payment came as a meal rather than coin. The work was unremarkable, but it placed him beside the men who actually sailed, veterans of Atlantic crossings, survivors of Caribbean storms, occasional privateers who had served under letters of marque during the wars that punctuated England's late Stuart years. These men did not speak romantically about the sea. They spoke practically, in the way of people who have learned that survival depends on precision. They described how to judge a coming squall from the colour of the western sky at dusk. They explained which knots held under full strain and which ones gave way at the worst possible moment. They discussed the Spanish guardacostas that prowled near Havana, the French privateers working the Atlantic approaches, the ports where a sailor could spend an entire year's wages in a single extravagant night. Edward listened with the particular attention of someone who had already decided, without quite putting the thought into words, that this was the life he intended to pursue. Bristol itself was not a static backdrop to these years. The glorious revolution of 1688 had replaced King James II with William of Orange, and the city had backed the new king with genuine enthusiasm, seeing in the Protestant succession a guarantee of the commercial freedoms that underwrote its prosperity. But enthusiasm did not protect trade. The 9 Years' War against France brought French privateers into the western approaches, and Bristol merchants lost ships to enemy raiders with regularity. Parliament's response was to encourage privateering legally sanctioned attacks on enemy shipping through the generous issue of letters of marque. Posters appeared on tavern doors offering shares in privateering ventures, promising prize money that dwarfed the ordinary seaman's wages of 20 shillings a month. The promise lingered in the air even when the ships came home empty or failed to come home at all. Around these larger forces, daily life in Bristol kept its ancient rhythm. Street sellers called out their wares at dawn: oysters, hot rolls, small beer. Apprentices swept shop fronts while masters inspected incoming cargoes. Afternoons on the quays grew thunderously loud with unloading. Ropes hissed through iron blocks. Chains rang on stone pavements. And men shouted orders in every accent from Cornwall to the Orkneys. Evenings brought sailors ashore Welsh, Scottish, Irish, and increasingly men from farther reaches of the Atlantic world who filled the taverns with strong cider, rum punch when a sugar ship was in, and boiled mutton stew thickened with ship's biscuit when money ran short. It was into this relentless, salt-crusted, magnificently chaotic world that Edward Teach grew, absorbing it not through any formal instruction, but through the slow accumulation of everything a watchful boy hears when the men around him forget they are being observed. There is a particular kind of restlessness that takes root in boys who grow up watching other men leave. Edward Teach would have known it well. Every morning, the tide carried ships outward past the mouth of the Avon, their sails filling as they caught the wind off the Severn estuary, and every departure was a small argument against staying. Bristol in the 1690s was a city caught between two worlds, the older rhythms of coastal trade and the newer, more dangerous energies of Atlantic empire. The political upheaval that had brought William of Orange to the throne in 1688 had settled into a fragile stability by the time Edward was entering his teenage years. But the consequences of that revolution were still working themselves through the city's commercial life in ways that touched even the households nearest the water. William's Protestant succession meant war with Catholic France, first the 9 Years' War, which ground on until 1697, and then, after barely 5 years of uneasy peace, the War of the Spanish Succession, which began in 1701 and would not end until 1713. For Bristol's merchants, these were not abstract dynastic quarrels. They were economic disasters dressed in the language of religion and royal succession. French privateers worked the western approaches with increasing boldness, snapping up Bristol-bound merchantmen loaded with sugar and tobacco. Insurance rates climbed, convoy schedules grew erratic, and the men who depended on steady wages found that the sea, which had always been dangerous, had become something closer to lethal. Parliament's answer was the Letter of Marque, a document issued by the Crown that transformed a merchant vessel into a temporary warship, authorising her captain to attack and seize enemy shipping and keep a portion of whatever was taken. The system was not new. England had used privateers since the Elizabethan era, and the Spanish had good reason to remember the damage they could do. But the scale of privateering during the War of the Spanish Succession was something different. Hundreds of vessels were fitted out in Bristol, Liverpool, and London, pierced for guns and stocked with powder and shot. Merchants who had previously risked only cargo now risked hulls and crew for the chance of prize money that could dwarf any legitimate voyage's profit. The waterfront changed character almost overnight. Chandlers who had supplied salt pork and cordage began stocking pistols and cutlasses. Tavern boards advertised shares in privateering ventures alongside the usual announcements of cargo sailings, and the crews that assembled on the quays reflected the new reality, not just experienced merchant sailors, but former naval men, soldiers between campaigns, and younger men like Edward who had grown up watching the harbour and calculating their chances. For a boy with no land to inherit and no trade apprenticeship behind him, the arithmetic of privateering was genuinely compelling. Ordinary seamen earned perhaps 20 shillings a month, A single successful privateering cruise could yield shares worth many times that, paid in coin from captured cargoes rather than promised by a distant owner. Edward's response to these pressures was characteristically quiet. He did not rush to the privateering offices. Instead, he continued his work on the quays, but with sharper attention to what he observed. He watched how the privateering captains carried themselves differently from the merchant masters with a quality of alertness that never quite relaxed. As though every horizon might produce either an opportunity or a threat, he listened when veterans described the practical realities of prize-taking the chase under full sail. The warning shot, the boarding party climbing a stranger's hull with weapons ready, the swift inventory of a hold that might contain silk or silver or nothing more valuable than dried fish. He noted the difference between the men who came back prosperous and those who returned empty-handed or not at all, and he began to form conclusions about what separated the two groups. Skill mattered enormously. So did judgment. The ability to read weather, to assess a target's likely resistance before committing to an attack, to know when to press forward and when to turn away. These were not qualities taught in any classroom. They were accumulated through years at sea, through the patient observation of men who had already made the mistakes that killed others. Edward was not yet ready to commit himself, but he was already building the foundations of the man he intended to become, storing away every lesson the harbour offered with the methodical patience that would later define his leadership at sea. By the time Edward was approaching his late teens, Bristol's waterfront had shaped him in ways that were both visible and invisible. The visible part was physical. He had grown unusually tall for the era, well over 6 feet. With the broad shoulders and heavy hands of a man who had spent years hauling rope and shifting cargo, his frame set him apart in a crowd where most men stood closer to 5.5 feet, and it gave him a natural authority that required no performance to maintain. The invisible part was harder to articulate, but perhaps more important. He had developed the habit of silence in situations where other young men filled the air with words. He watched before he spoke. He listened to arguments before choosing sides. He absorbed the unwritten codes of the waterfront, which debts demanded immediate payment, which captains kept their word, which vessels were sound and which would founder in the first real blow, with the thoroughness of someone who understood that survival depended on accurate information rather than comfortable assumptions. The city of Bristol, with its noise and smell and constant motion, had given him something that no formal education could have provided: a deep, practical understanding of how the world actually worked when money, weather, and human ambition all pressed against each other at once. The horizon that stretched beyond the Severn estuary was not a mystery to him. It was a destination, waiting only for the right moment and the right vessel to make it real. The quays of Bristol had a way of sorting boys quickly. Those who could not stomach the work drifted back toward the town within days, finding apprenticeships with bakers or cobblers or the printers who were beginning to multiply along the commercial streets. Those who stayed developed a particular toughness that had nothing theatrical about it, a practical hardness earned through cold mornings, heavy loads, and the constant low-level danger of working near machinery that could kill without warning. Edward Teach stayed, more than stayed. He pushed deeper into the waterfront world with each passing season, moving from the outer edges of the economy errand boy, barrel carrier, message runner toward its centre, the ships themselves. The transition happened gradually, as most important transitions do, through a series of small steps that only look deliberate in retrospect. A captain noticed his strength when he helped shift a jammed capstan bar that 2 smaller men had failed to move. A ship's cook offered him regular work carrying stores aboard a coastal ketch bound for Plymouth. A mate on a Bristol to Liverpool run saw him coiling rope with a neatness that suggested someone had taken the time to teach him properly, though no one remembered doing so. By his mid-teens, Edward was making regular short coastal voyages a week to London, a few days down to Plymouth, occasional runs up the Irish Sea to Liverpool and back. These were not glamorous passages. The vessels were small, the work unrelenting, and the pay barely enough to cover food and a space in a sailor's lodging house when they touched port. But they were exactly what he needed, because they placed him inside the living mechanism of maritime work, rather than observing it from the outside. The education these short voyages provided was entirely practical, and it covered every dimension of the sailor's craft simultaneously. Navigation on coastal runs relied almost entirely on dead reckoning, estimating the ship's position by tracking speed, direction, and elapsed time, then adjusting for the tidal streams and currents that could push a vessel miles off course in a single watch. Edward learned to throw a chip log over the stern and count the knots as they ran through his fingers, translating the feel of the line into a speed estimate that he then marked on the slate. He learned to read a compass without hesitating, to correct for the magnetic variation that differed between the Bristol Channel and the Thames estuary, and to recognise the landmarks that served as navigation fixes along the English coast, the particular profile of a headland, the colour change in the water above a known shoal, the bearing of a lighthouse at night when its rhythm identified it against the darkness. Alongside navigation came rope work, and rope work on a working vessel was not a single skill but dozens of separate ones, each with its own logic and its own consequences if done incorrectly. A knot that looked right but was tied wrong could give way under load at the worst possible moment. A splice poorly made would weaken the line at precisely the point where it needed to be strongest. Edward learned these distinctions through repetition and occasional failure, with older hands correcting him, not unkindly, but without sentiment, in the manner of men who understood that bad habits at sea eventually became catastrophes. What separated Edward from many of his contemporaries during these years was not raw talent. There were other strong, capable young men working the same coastal runs, but a particular quality of attention. He watched experienced sailors not merely to copy their movements, but to understand the reasoning behind them. When a mate adjusted the set of a sail in a freshening wind, Edward asked himself why that particular adjustment and not another. When a captain chose to anchor in a specific spot rather than pushing on through the night, Edward studied the chart and the weather and tried to work out the calculation that had produced that decision. He kept a small notebook, a cheap affair of rough paper stitched between boards, in which he copied tables of tidal heights for different ports and rough sketches of coastlines that he had observed from the deck. The notebook was a practical tool, not a diary. It contained no reflections on his feelings or ambitions, only information that might prove useful on a future voyage. This habit of storing knowledge systematically, rather than relying purely on memory, would remain with him for the rest of his life, and would eventually fill with the soundings and anchorages of waters far beyond the English coast. His physical development during these years matched the demands of the work. By his late teens he stood well over 6 feet, with a frame that had been hardened by hauling and climbing into something genuinely formidable. His hands had developed the thick calluses that never fully softened again regardless of how much time was spent ashore. His face had taken on the weathered quality of someone who spent most of his waking hours exposed to wind and salt spray, and a full black beard had begun to grow with a density that made him look older than his years. The men around him during these coastal voyages were a cross-section of maritime Britain at the turn of the 18th century Scots, who had been pressed from fishing boats off the Firth of Forth, Irishmen escaping poverty in Munster and Connaught, Welshmen who sang in the evening watch with a seriousness that suggested the music mattered as much as the words. There were also older English hands who had served in the Navy during the 9 Years' War and carried with them a detailed knowledge of gunnery and fleet tactics that rarely found expression on a coasting ketch but surfaced in conversation during long night watches. Edward listened to all of them with equal care, storing away the naval veteran's account of a fleet action off Ushant alongside the Scottish fisherman's method for reading weather from the movement of seabirds. He developed no strong loyalties to any particular group or origin. What interested him was competence, wherever it came from. By the time he was ready to attempt his first Atlantic crossing, he had already acquired the foundation of a seaman's education that most men spent an entire career accumulating. The coastal voyages had been preparation, patient and thorough, for something much larger. The spring of 1701 arrived in Bristol with the particular energy of a city preparing for war. Queen Anne had just inherited the throne following the death of William III, and the diplomatic machinery that would soon produce the War of the Spanish Succession was already grinding into motion. Merchants along the quays spoke in tight, worried clusters about French intentions in the Caribbean and the likely disruption to the sugar convoys that formed the backbone of Bristol's prosperity. Against this backdrop of political anxiety, Edward Teach signed articles aboard a merchant brig bound for the West Indies, two-masted, broad in the beam, perhaps 100 tons, built for cargo rather than speed. He was roughly 21 years old. He carried little beyond a change of clothes wrapped in oilcloth, a sheath knife worn at his belt, and the accumulated practical knowledge of several years on coastal runs. The ship's hold was packed with English woolens, iron goods, and barrels of nails destined for planters in Barbados and Jamaica who needed manufactured goods and could pay for them in sugar and rum. Her captain was a weathered Plymouth man named Jonas Hargrove, who had crossed the Atlantic more times than he could clearly remember, and who ran his ship with a quiet efficiency that made no room for sentiment, but considerable room for competence. When Hargrove looked at the tall young Bristol man standing on his deck with a directness that most crew members lacked, he saw something worth watching. He signed him on without hesitation and assigned him to the starboard watch. The Atlantic crossing changed everything, not through any single dramatic event, but through the slow accumulation of experiences that had no equivalent in coastal sailing, and that remade a man from the inside out whether he wished it or not. The first thing that struck Edward was the scale, the sheer, almost incomprehensible emptiness of open ocean after the busy, landmark-rich English coast. For days after losing sight of land, there was nothing in any direction but water and sky, the two merging at a horizon that seemed to recede perpetually, no matter how much distance the ship covered. Navigation became a matter of pure calculation. With no headlands to fix a position and no lighthouses to confirm a course, dead reckoning over Atlantic distances required a different order of precision than anything Edward had practiced in the Bristol Channel. Speed estimates had to be made 4 times a day at minimum, compass courses corrected for leeway and current, and the accumulated errors of each watch had to be identified and compensated before they built into a deviation that could put the ship hundreds of miles from where the chart said she should be. Captain Hargrove taught the younger hands these corrections in the same unhurried way he did everything, explaining the principle once, demonstrating the application twice, and then expecting the lesson to have been absorbed. Edward absorbed it with the thoroughness that had always distinguished him from men who learned only what was absolutely necessary to avoid punishment. The physical reality of deep-water life aboard a working merchantman in 1701 bore almost no resemblance to the romantic notions that circulated in Bristol taverns. The ship's routine began at 4 bells in the morning watch, before full daylight, when the cook lit, the galley fire and the watch on deck began pumping the bilges, a daily necessity on any wooden vessel, which leaked constantly through 100 small gaps in its planking and caulking. Breakfast was oatmeal boiled with salt pork scraps that had been soaking overnight to remove some of the brine. Dinner was a stew of salt beef and dried peas, thickened with ship's biscuit so hard that men tapped it sharply against the table edge before eating to dislodge the weevils that lived inside. Supper was whatever remained from the midday meal, usually very little. Water was rationed strictly once the casks had been at sea for several weeks, and the contents had begun to develop the greenish tinge and faintly foul smell that came from standing in wood too long. Men chewed tobacco to manage thirst, and when the captain suspected scurvy was beginning, the slow bleeding of the gums, the aching joints, the terrible fatigue that set in after weeks without fresh food, he issued lemons from the small stock kept in the great cabin for precisely that purpose. Clothing consisted of loose canvas trousers, a checked flannel shirt, and a wool jacket that grew heavier with salt and grease as the voyage progressed. Shoes were unnecessary on deck, where bare feet gripped wet planking far more reliably than leather soles. Edward's large frame made him genuinely useful at the capstan during tacking manoeuvres, where the sheer physical effort of hauling a heavy yard around required men of significant strength. but he also proved equally useful at the more delicate work of splicing rope and repairing running rigging, tasks that required fine motor control that his size made surprising, but his patience made entirely natural. The first landfall in Barbados struck Edward with a force that no amount of description could have prepared him for. After 6 weeks at sea, 6 weeks of salt beef and biscuit and rationed water, and the constant rolling motion of a hull working through Atlantic swells, the sudden appearance of a green island rising from the blue water felt almost hallucinatory in its vividness. Bridgetown's heat was the first shock. A wall of warm air carrying the scent of molasses, wood smoke, and something floral and unidentifiable that had no equivalent in Bristol. The crew was allowed ashore in small groups, and Edward walked streets lined with whitewashed warehouses and palm-thatched taverns, tasting mango for the first time and eating fresh fish grilled over open coals until the memory of salt beef felt like a punishment from a previous life. He spent his few coins carefully, a new linen shirt, a small brass compass worn in a leather pouch around his neck, and used his remaining hours ashore watching the wharves, where enslaved workers loaded hogsheads of sugar onto lighters bound for the anchored merchantmen. The contrast between what he observed there and the rougher quality of shipboard life where every man shared the same rations and the same weather settled into him quietly, without producing any immediate conclusion, but leaving a mark that subsequent years would only deepen. The return voyage from Barbados carried sugar, rum, and a few hogsheads of indigo that sat low in the hold and gave the brig a heavier, more deliberate roll on the northward passage. Edward Teach stood his watches with the same attention he had given the outward crossing. But now, with the added dimension of experience, he knew what a mid-Atlantic squall looked like before it arrived, knew how the ship's behaviour changed when she was deeply laden versus light, knew which members of the crew could be relied upon when the weather turned serious, and which ones found reasons to stay below. Captain Hargrove noticed the development and began assigning him more responsible positions during the return, placing him at the helm during difficult watches and asking his opinion on sail trim in conditions that had no single correct answer. These small promotions meant nothing in terms of pay, but everything in terms of the knowledge they delivered. A man standing at the helm of a laden brig in a following sea learned things about hull behaviour and steering that could not be taught in any other way. By the time the brig cleared the Bristol Channel and tied up at the familiar quays, Edward had completed his first Atlantic crossing with a competence that exceeded what most merchant sailors achieved in twice the time. He signed on for a second voyage almost immediately, this time to Jamaica, and then a third, to the Virginia tobacco ports on the Chesapeake. The years between 1703 and 1708 passed in this rhythm, crossing after crossing, each one adding layers to the understanding he had begun building on the Bristol quays. Boston Harbour in winter was a different world entirely from the Caribbean ports he had come to know. The same forest of masts, but encased in ice during the coldest months. The rigging coated in frost that caught the pale northern light and turned the entire anchorage into something fragile and crystalline. The waterfront taverns there spoke in broad Yankee accents about matters that had little to do with sugar or rum timber rights. Fishing grounds. The perpetual grievance against customs officers who arrived from London with fresh authority and no understanding of local conditions. New York offered a more chaotic mix of Dutch commercial traditions and English administrative overlay. The streets narrower than Boston's, and the merchants slightly more willing to deal in goods that did not bear close examination. Edward moved through these ports with the same observant quietness that characterized him everywhere, accumulating impressions without rushing to conclusions. He noted how colonial merchants operated differently from their Bristol counterparts, more willing to bend regulations, more comfortable with informal arrangements, more dependent on personal trust in the absence of reliable legal enforcement. These observations had no immediate application, but they built a picture of the Atlantic world as a place where the gap between official rules and actual practice was both enormous and completely normal. The Virginia tobacco ports gave him something different again, wide. Muddy rivers lined with plantations whose prosperity rested entirely on enslaved labour. The air permanently heavy with the sweet, slightly sickening smell of curing tobacco leaf. He worked alongside enslaved men rolling hogsheads down to the wharves, and the silence between them contained the full weight of the system that separated their circumstances. The crossing that tested him most severely came in his fourth Atlantic voyage, somewhere in the latitude of the Azores in late October, when a full North Atlantic gale caught the vessel under reduced canvas and demonstrated in approximately 12 hours everything that the sea was capable of doing to a wooden ship and the people inside it. Waves broke over the waist in solid green water, sweeping loose gear overboard and filling the deck to the rail before draining through the scuppers. Edward was sent aloft with 2 other men to secure a foretopsail that had begun to tear free of its gaskets and was slatting violently enough to threaten the entire foremast. The yard beneath their feet bucked and jerked with each roll of the ship, the canvas cracking like cannon fire in the wind, the spray driving horizontally into their faces with enough force to sting exposed skin into numbness. They fought the sail down and lashed it with fingers that had stopped feeling the rope they were handling. When they reached the deck again, Hargrove simply nodded once no praise, no additional comment, and turned back to the compass. It was the merchant service's version of approval, and Edward understood it immediately. What he also understood, as he wiped salt water from his face and checked that the men beside him were uninjured, was that the fear he had felt going aloft had been present, but not dominant. Something else had been present alongside it, a focused clarity that came from having no choice but to complete the task. Fear, he concluded, was a signal worth noting, but not worth obeying. It pointed to the danger without knowing what to do about it. Competence was what addressed the danger. The distinction between the two would inform every decision he made at sea from that point forward. By 1708, Edward had crossed the Atlantic at least 8 times, in vessels ranging from 2-masted brigs to full-rigged ships of 300 tons. His accumulated knowledge covered navigation by dead reckoning and celestial observation. Gunnery at the basic level required of merchant sailors who sometimes needed to defend their cargoes. Sail handling in conditions from flat calm to full storm. The management of provisions on passages lasting anywhere from 5 weeks to 3 months. And the social dynamics of mixed crews whose members came from a dozen different backgrounds and spoke 4 or 5 different languages. He had also acquired something harder to name, a clear-eyed understanding of the economics of Atlantic maritime life that left him permanently dissatisfied with its rewards. Ordinary seamen earned 20 shillings a month when trade was good, less when it was not. Mates earned slightly more but still depended entirely on the decisions of owners who sat comfortably ashore while the risks accumulated at sea. The money that actually moved through the Atlantic economy, the sugar fortunes, the tobacco profits, the prize money from successful privateering cruises flowed toward men who owned ships or held commissions, not toward the men who sailed them. This arithmetic had been obvious to him for years. What the 8 crossings had added was the certainty that he possessed the skills to pursue a different kind of arrangement. The question was no longer whether to seek it. The question was when and how. There is a moment in most lives when a decision that has been building quietly for years finally crystallizes into something that can be acted upon. For Edward Teach, that moment came on a humid evening in Kingston Harbour, Jamaica, in the year 1709. He was standing on the quarterdeck of the Snow he had sailed from Bristol, watching the sun drop behind the blue mountains that rose in dramatic purple ridges behind the town. The harbour was busy in the way that Caribbean ports always were at dusk. Small boats crossing between anchored vessels, the distant sound of a fiddle from a waterfront tavern, the smell of cooking fires mixing with the salt air that came off the bay. He had been calculating, as he often did in quiet moments, the arithmetic of his situation. 8 Atlantic crossings, years of steady service, a reputation among captains that guaranteed him a berth whenever he wanted one, and at the end of all that wages that barely covered his needs. No share in the vessels he helped keep afloat, no prospect of accumulating the kind of money that would let him choose his own path. The privateering talk that had filled Bristol taverns since his childhood had not faded. If anything, It had grown more specific and more urgent as the War of the Spanish Succession entered what everyone hoped were its final years. Men who had taken French and Spanish prizes came back to Kingston with coin in their belts and a particular quality of ease that ordinary merchant sailors never quite achieved. That evening, watching the sun go down behind the mountains, Edward made the decision that he had been moving toward for the better part of a decade. When the snow paid off in Bristol the following spring, he would not sign for another merchant voyage. The return to Bristol in early 1710 was not sentimental. He walked the familiar streets with fresh eyes, the same wet cobblestones, the same smell of tar and river mud, the same noise of the harbour that had surrounded him since childhood, and saw them as the backdrop to a life he was preparing to leave rather than the foundation of one he intended to continue. The city had changed in small ways during his years of crossing. New warehouses had gone up near the quays. A fire had taken several houses in one of the narrow lanes behind the chandler's district. The faces in the taverns were different, though the conversations were largely the same: cargo prices, convoy schedules, the latest news from the war. What had changed most significantly was the privateering infrastructure. By 1710, the fitting out of armed vessels had become a well-organised business in Bristol. Merchant houses near the quays maintained offices specifically dedicated to privateering ventures, handling everything from the application for letters of marque to the insurance of the hull and the recruitment of crews. Edward walked straight to one such office within days of arriving in port and began making inquiries about available berths. The man he needed to find was Benjamin Hornigold, a name that had circulated through the Caribbean ports for the past several years as a captain who ran tight. Successful operations and kept his crews paid promptly. Hornigold was in Bristol fitting out a sloop of about 90 tons, recently purchased from a sugar trader and being modified for combat gun ports cut, carriage pieces mounted, extra powder and shot loaded into the magazine. He hired Edward as an able seaman with the specific promise of an extra quarter share if he proved himself at the guns. The articles that Hornigold read aloud on the sloop's deck before she cleared the dock contained the clearest statement of principles that Edward had ever heard applied to life at sea. Each man would receive one full share of any prize taken. After the vessel's owners claimed their portion and the captain received his too, men wounded in action would be compensated from a common fund held aboard 600 pieces of 8 for the loss of a right arm, 400 for a leg, proportionally lesser amounts for fingers or eyes. No man was permitted to strike another aboard ship. Disputes between crew members were deferred until the company reached land, where the matter could be settled without endangering the vessel. Major decisions whether to pursue a particular target, which course to sail after a capture, were put to a vote of the assembled company. Edward listened to these terms with an attention that went beyond ordinary interest. They addressed, point by point, every injustice he had observed during years in the merchant service. The fixed compensation for injuries meant that a man who lost an arm fighting for the company's profit was not simply abandoned to poverty. The prohibition on striking fellow crew members meant that the casual brutality of some merchant captains, the cuff across the head, the boot applied to a slow worker, had no place here. The voting system meant that the men who bore the risks had genuine influence over the decisions that created them. He signed his name without hesitation and felt something settle in his chest that had been restless for years. The sloop slipped down the Avon on the morning tide in late February of 1701, clearing the Bristol Channel into a grey Atlantic swell with the cold wind of early spring filling her sails. Standing at the helm during his first watch, Edward felt the difference immediately, not in the physical sensation of the deck beneath his feet, which was familiar enough, but in the quality of attention that now surrounded him on every side. This was not a crew hauling cargo for distant owners. These were men with a direct stake in every decision made at sea. Men who cleaned their pistols alongside their tackle and discussed gunnery ranges in the same breath as sail trim. The smell of black powder had joined the older smells of tar and salt that had defined every vessel he had sailed before. It was a small change in the chemistry of the air, but it signalled something fundamental about the nature of the voyage ahead. The War of the Spanish Succession was entering its 12th year, and the Caribbean still offered French and Spanish merchant ships for the taking. Edward Teach was no longer a young man watching other men leave Bristol on the morning tide. He was one of the men leaving, bound outward under articles that finally made sense, toward waters where skill and nerve could translate directly into reward. The sloop cleared the Bristol Channel on a grey February morning and met the open Atlantic with a purposefulness that distinguished her immediately from the merchant vessels Edward had sailed before. Everything about the operation spoke of intent. The lookouts doubled immediately after the last headland dropped below the horizon. The guns were exercised on the first full day at sea, the crews running through the sequence of loading, aiming, and clearing the piece with the focused repetition of men who understood that hesitation in action cost lives. Pistols and cutlasses were issued from the arms chest and inspected by the mate before being returned to their racks. The difference between this vessel and a merchant snow was not merely the weapons mounted along her sides, it was the quality of attention that every man aboard brought to every task. The constant low-level readiness that replaced the merchant sailor's more relaxed relationship with danger. Edward absorbed the new atmosphere quickly. He had always been a man who adapted to his environment through observation rather than declaration, and the privateer's world rewarded exactly the qualities he had spent years developing. He was assigned to the starboard gun crew and took his position at the number 2 piece with the same quiet competence he had brought to every previous role. The gun captain, a scarred Liverpudlian named Bates who had served on naval frigates during the 9 Years' War, showed him the finer points of elevation adjustment and taught him to judge the ship's roll before touching the linstock to the powder. Edward learned by watching Bates once and then doing it correctly himself, which earned him a nod of approval that was the Liverpudlian's version of high praise. Life aboard the privateer settled into a pattern that combined the familiar rhythms of merchant seamanship with the additional disciplines of a fighting vessel. Mornings began the same way they always had pumps. Galley fire. Breakfast from the common pot. But where merchant mornings then turned to cargo handling or sail adjustment based on weather, privateer mornings turned to drill. The crew practiced boarding tactics on the main deck, dividing into parties with specific assignments. One group would secure the enemy's deck on arrival, preventing resistance from organising. A second party would go directly below for the strong room or the cargo manifest. A third would stand ready at the pumps in case the hull took damage during a close engagement. Teach was placed with the deck-securing party, a role that suited his size and his ability to move quickly in tight spaces. He practiced the boarding sequence until it felt automatic the moment of crossing from one hull to the other. The instant assessment of who on the enemy deck posed the most immediate threat. The specific movements that controlled space without necessarily requiring violence. Hornigold drilled these sequences with patience, understanding that the difference between a boarding that succeeded cleanly and one that descended into chaos often came down to whether each man knew exactly where he was supposed to be in the first 3 seconds after crossing the rail. The Atlantic passage to the Caribbean took 9 days longer than Edward's previous crossings, because Hornigold chose a southern route that added distance but reduced the risk of encountering French naval patrols working the northern lanes. They watered briefly at Madeira, taking on fresh casks and a small quantity of fruit that the surgeon insisted on for the crew's health before the long ocean leg. The crossing itself passed without significant incident. One moderate gale that lasted 18 hours and required all hands on deck to manage the shortened canvas. And one period of almost complete calm near the latitude of the Canaries that left the sloop drifting in a flat, oily sea while the crew fished over the side and waited for wind. Edward used the calm to study the charts that Hornigold kept in the great cabin, examining the routes that connected the Caribbean islands to one another and to the Spanish Main. The captain was open with the navigational information, explaining the way the trade winds shaped sailing paths through the islands and identifying the passages where French and Spanish merchant traffic was most concentrated. These details went directly into the notebook that Edward had carried since his merchant days, copied neatly alongside the coastal sketches and tidal tables that already filled its pages. He was building a mental map of the Atlantic world that would eventually surpass in detail anything that could be bought in a chart seller's shop. The first prize came off the coast of Hispaniola in the 5th week of the cruise. A French brigantine was sighted running before the wind with all sails set. her hull riding light in the water in the way that suggested a recent departure from port with cargo freshly loaded. Hornigold called the company to the deck and put the chase to a vote unanimous. As it almost always was when the target looked promising, the sloop spread her canvas and closed steadily over the course of 2 hours. The French vessel attempting to gain distance by throwing water barrels overboard to lighten her load, a manoeuvre that slowed her as much as it helped. When the privateer came within range, Hornigold hoisted British colours and fired a single gun across the brigantine's bow, the universal signal that demanded immediate surrender. The Frenchman struck without a fight, her captain coming to the rail with his hands visible and his papers ready. Edward boarded with the prize crew, climbing the brigantine's side for the first time as a man with authority rather than a supplicant, and felt the unfamiliar deck shift under his feet as the two hulls moved independently of each other. The hold contained coffee and indigo valuable goods that would sell well in any English colonial port. The French captain, a thin man with anxious eyes, handed over the manifest without protest and asked only that his crew be allowed to keep their personal possessions. Edward relayed the request to Hornigold, who agreed immediately. Unnecessary cruelty was bad for business in the most direct possible sense. It made future captains fight rather than surrender, increasing risk and reducing profit in equal measure. The prize was assessed, the cargo inventoried, and the division calculated according to the articles. Each man received his share that same evening, counted out in coin on the main deck, while the sun went down behind the Western Islands. For Edward Teach, holding his first prize share in his calloused hands, the decision made in Kingston Harbour finally felt fully real. The War of the Spanish Succession ground toward its conclusion through 1711 and 1712, with the particular exhaustion of a conflict that had lasted long enough to outlive most of its original justifications. Armies in Europe continued to manoeuvre across Flanders and the Iberian Peninsula, but the energy had gone out of the fighting in the way that energy always leaves a fire that has consumed most of its available fuel. In the Caribbean, the practical effects were already being felt before the diplomats gathered at Utrecht to formalize what the battlefield had largely decided. French and Spanish merchant convoys grew more cautious, hugging coastlines and travelling in tighter groups with naval escorts that had not been available earlier in the war. Prizes became harder to find and more dangerous to pursue. Hornigold's squadron responded by ranging more widely, pushing into the waters off the Spanish Main and occasionally working the northern lanes toward the Carolinas. But the golden period of easy captures that had characterized the early years of the cruise was clearly ending. Edward observed these changes with the same careful attention he brought to everything else, noting in his notebook not just the navigational details of new waters, but the broader pattern of how military conflict shaped commercial opportunity at sea. The lesson was becoming unmistakable. The window that war created for men operating on the edges of legality was always temporary, always dependent on the sustained inattention of governments that had larger concerns. When those governments resolved their quarrels, they would eventually turn their attention to the men who had exploited the gap. His role within Hornigold's company had expanded steadily through these years. What had begun as a gun crew position on the starboard battery had evolved through a series of quiet promotions into something closer to a senior officer's responsibilities. Hornigold sent him to lead boarding parties on prizes that required more careful handling vessels whose crews seemed uncertain about surrendering, or whose cargo manifests suggested valuable goods that needed expert assessment to identify and protect. He had developed a particular method for these situations, approaching the prize captain with a directness that communicated both authority and the genuine possibility of fair treatment. He asked questions in a tone that expected honest answers and received them more often than not, because people facing an uncertain situation generally respond to calm competence with more cooperation than they give to threatening bluster. The prize captains he dealt with during these years remembered him as large, quiet, and entirely unambiguous, a man who made the available options perfectly clear without needing to raise his voice to do so. By 1712, Hornigold had given him formal command of a captured sloop that sailed as tender to the main vessel, carrying a small company of his own and handling the navigation and boarding details independently while remaining in communication with the larger ship. The experience of command, even on this modest scale, revealed something important. The skills that made a good officer under someone else's authority were not identical to the skills required to sustain an independent operation. Leadership at a distance, making decisions without immediate guidance, reading situations that no superior had anticipated and for which no standing instruction existed, demanded a quality of judgment that could only be developed by actually exercising it. The Treaty of Utrecht was signed in April of 1713, and the news reached the Caribbean through the usual channels: merchant ships from London, dispatches to colonial governors, the gradual appearance of Spanish and French vessels in waters they had previously avoided. The effect on the privateering community was immediate and severe. Commissions were revoked without ceremony. The armed sloops that had operated legally under letters of marque became, overnight, vessels without purpose, or rather, vessels whose crews possessed skills and habits that the peacetime world had no legitimate use for. Hornigold gathered the company on deck when the news arrived and explained the situation plainly. The commission was finished. Men who wished to return to England or the colonies could draw their final shares and sign off. Those who wished to remain in the Caribbean would need to find other arrangements. The gathering on the deck was quiet in a way that spoke of men doing rapid private calculations. The shares accumulated over 3 years of cruising amounted to genuine money for most of them, enough for a small stake in a merchant voyage, or a year of comfortable living ashore, or the purchase of a modest vessel for coastal trading. Edward collected his final share, nearly £300, more money than he had ever held at one time, and stayed where he was, while others began making their way to the rail. He had no intention of returning to Bristol or signing on to another merchant voyage at reduced peacetime wages. The Caribbean still held opportunities. They simply operated under different names than they had during the war years. The gathering dispersed slowly, men moving in small groups to discuss their options and make their arrangements. Edward Teach remained on the deck of a vessel that no longer had a legal commission, in waters that were no longer technically at war, holding money that represented everything the past 3 years had produced. The treaty had drawn a line across the maritime world, placing everything that had come before it on one side and everything that came after on the other. He stood at that line and looked forward rather than back, understanding with perfect clarity that the skills he had developed under Hornigold's commission did not become worthless simply because a group of diplomats in a Dutch city had decided that the war was over. The weeks immediately following the end of the commission saw the privateer community scatter in ways that reflected the full range of individual circumstances and temperaments. Some men returned to merchant service with genuine relief, preferring the modest security of regular wages to the higher risks and rewards of armed cruising. Others drifted toward the smaller Caribbean islands, looking for work in the fishing trade or the coastal carrying business that connected the plantation economies. A handful headed for Nassau in the Bahamas. Drawn by reports of a settlement where former privateers had established a loose community beyond the reach of any colonial authority, Edward moved with this last group, not because he had a specific plan for what came next, but because Nassau represented exactly the quality of open possibility that the peacetime merchant world conspicuously lacked. The wind that had pushed Hornigold's sloop through 3 years of successful cruising was gone now, replaced by something more uncertain and more interesting. Edward set his course into it without hesitation. New Providence Island sat in the northern Bahamas like a place that geography had designed specifically for people who needed to disappear. Its harbour was shallow enough to exclude the larger naval vessels that might otherwise have come to enforce order, yet deep enough to shelter the fast, light draft sloops that former privateers preferred. Its position placed it within convenient reach of the Florida Straits, where the Gulf Stream carried homeward-bound Spanish treasure fleets and English traders in a concentrated stream of maritime traffic that passed close enough to observe, under the right circumstances, to intercept. The surrounding cays offered dozens of anchorages where a vessel could hide behind a coral reef or a mangrove island and become effectively invisible to anyone not already aware of its presence. And the island's distance from the main colonial centres, Jamaica to the south, the Carolinas to the north, Bermuda to the northeast meant that any authority wishing to impose order there faced a logistical problem, serious enough to discourage casual enforcement. By the time Edward Teach arrived in the summer of 1713 with his £300 and his leather-bound notebook, Nassau had already begun the transformation from a quiet watering stop into something more deliberate and more permanent. The British governor theoretically responsible for the Bahamas had departed months earlier, complaining of unpaid salary and recurrent fever, leaving behind an empty stockade, a single rusty cannon, and a population that had discovered in his absence that self-government suited them considerably better than the alternative. The settlement that Edward walked into was simultaneously chaotic and purposeful in a way that required adjustment from anyone arriving with prior expectations about how communities organized themselves. Perhaps 200 people lived there when he arrived, with the number climbing steadily as word spread through the Caribbean that Nassau offered sanctuary without interrogation. Former privateers from every island in the chain showed up men from Jamaica, Barbados, and the Leeward Islands who had held commissions and now found themselves without legitimate work. Deserters from merchant vessels arrived in stolen longboats. A number of escaped indentured servants had crossed from the Carolinas on anything that floated. The physical settlement occupied the strip of land behind the harbour in a loose arrangement of palm-thatched huts, canvas shelters stretched between driftwood poles, and occasional more substantial structures built from timber salvaged off wrecked vessels. There was no street plan, no designated market, and no building that served as any kind of official structure. What there was instead was a beach that served as the community's main thoroughfare, a series of cooking fires around which men gathered in the evenings, and a set of informal understandings about behaviour that had evolved through necessity rather than design. You did not steal from men in the community. You shared information about passing vessels and the movements of Spanish or naval patrols. You contributed labour when a ship needed careening and expected the same contribution in return when your own hull needed attention. These rules were never written down. They did not need to be, because the consequences of breaking them were immediately and practically enforced by the community itself. Edward settled into Nassau with the same methodical patience that had characterized his approach to every new environment since Bristol. He rented a corner of a larger shelter from a man who had arrived from Bermuda the previous month, stowed his sea chest and his pistols with the care of someone who understood that their condition might one day determine whether he lived or died, and began the process of learning the social geography of the settlement. This meant walking the beach at different hours, noting who talked to whom and under what circumstances. It meant sitting at the edge of cooking fire gatherings without contributing to the conversation until he had a reasonable picture of the relationships and histories involved. It meant accepting small tasks, helping careen a hull, carrying water from the inland springs, mending a torn sail for a man who would remember the favour that placed him inside the community's network of mutual obligation without drawing particular attention. His money he distributed carefully between several hiding places, some in an oilskin pouch buried under a distinctive rock near the eastern end of the beach, some carried in a belt beneath his shirt. The habit of financial caution that he had developed during the merchant years served him well here. He watched men who had arrived with substantial shares spend their money in weeks on rum and gambling and found themselves dependent on credit from tavern keepers who charged rates that guaranteed permanent debt. He spent his own money only on things that would directly extend his ability to operate powder. Shot, new cordage, a small-sounding lead for checking depths in unfamiliar anchorages. The community that surrounded him during these months was building something genuinely new, even if none of its members would have described it in those terms. They were practical men solving practical problems, and the solutions they arrived at through trial and error happened to constitute a functioning social order based on principles quite different from those governing the colonial world around them. The vote was the central mechanism, not universal suffrage in any modern sense, but the genuine practice of putting consequential decisions to the assembled group and abiding by the result: who would captain a vessel for the next cruise, whether to accept a particular man into the company, how to divide a prize whose components had different values to different people. These decisions were made collectively because collective decision-making turned out to be more stable than the alternative. A captain whose authority derived from a vote of the crew had a different relationship to that crew than one whose authority derived from an owner's appointment or a naval commission. He could be removed by the same mechanism that had placed him, which meant he was permanently accountable in the most direct possible way. Edward observed this system with the close attention of someone who was already, at some level he had not yet articulated clearly to himself, thinking about what it would mean to command under these conditions rather than simply follow within them. The story arrived in Nassau the way most important news arrived in that settlement, carried by a fisherman who had seen something remarkable and could not stop talking about it. In the late summer of 1715, a fleet of 11 Spanish treasure ships had attempted the northward passage through the Florida Straits during hurricane season, which experienced Caribbean sailors regarded as an act of institutional recklessness so profound that it bordered on the incomprehensible. The Spanish crown needed the silver. The schedules had been delayed repeatedly by bureaucratic complications in Havana, and someone in a position of authority had decided that the risk of waiting was greater than the risk of sailing. They were catastrophically wrong. A hurricane struck the fleet on the night of the 30th of July, 1715, driving every vessel in the convoy onto the reefs and shallow banks along a 30-mile stretch of Florida coastline. Perhaps 1,000 men died in the water that night. The ships, loaded with silver bars, gold coins, jewellery, and trade goods destined for the Spanish treasury in Seville, were scattered across the seabed in depths ranging from a few feet to several fathoms. The Spanish mounted an immediate salvage operation, establishing a camp on the beach near the main wreck sites and employing divers, many of them enslaved men with extraordinary breath-holding capacity, developed through years of pearl diving to recover what they could from the shallower side. But the scale of the disaster exceeded any organised salvage effort, and word spread quickly through the Caribbean that treasure lay on the Florida reefs essentially unguarded, waiting for anyone with a fast boat and a willingness to work in shallow water. Edward heard the story one evening around a cooking fire, where 6 men were talking over the possibilities with the focused energy of people who have identified an opportunity and are calculating how to reach it before the obvious competition does. The legal situation was characteristically murky. The Spanish crown claimed ownership of everything on those wrecks under international maritime law, and had issued warnings to colonial governors about unauthorized salvage. The colonial governors had passed those warnings along to their populations with the level of enthusiasm that characterized most regulatory communication in the 18th century Atlantic world, which is to say with complete indifference to whether anyone actually complied. In practice, boats from the Carolinas, Jamaica, and Bermuda were already working the wreck sites alongside the official Spanish salvagers, paying nominal fees when Spanish officials were watching and helping themselves freely when they were not. The distance from Nassau to the Florida coast was manageable in a fast sloop 3 days with favourable winds, perhaps 5 in poor conditions. The rewards could be substantial. Men who had made early trips were returning with bags of silver reales and occasional gold pieces that they displayed with the quiet satisfaction of people who have found money in a place they were not supposed to be looking. Edward listened to these accounts with the same careful attention he gave to everything, separating the reliable information from the inevitable exaggeration and building a practical picture of what the work actually involved. What it involved, as he understood it, was primarily a question of organisation. The physical challenge of recovering silver from shallow water wreck sites was real but manageable for men with maritime experience. The obstacles were depth and visibility clear. Caribbean water allowed divers to see what they were reaching for, but holding breath long enough to work a jammed chest lid or lever a heavy bar free of surrounding debris required practice and physical conditioning. The logistical challenge was supplying a small crew for the duration of a working visit to a coastline with no settlements, maintaining the boat in good condition in waters that could turn rough without warning, and managing the constant possibility that Spanish officials might arrive and demand either payment or departure. Edward spent a week gathering more detailed information before committing himself, talking to men who had already made the trip and asking the specific questions that distinguished someone planning an operation from someone simply expressing enthusiasm. How deep were the main sites? What tools had proved most useful for moving cargo underwater? Which Spanish officials were genuinely inclined to enforce the rules, and which ones were primarily interested in their share of whatever was? Recovered, the answers built a picture that was encouraging in its specifics. He then approached two men from the old Hornigold cruises whose judgment and discretion he trusted, explained the opportunity as he understood it, and proposed that they pool their remaining resources to purchase a vessel suitable for the work. The sloop they bought was 30 tons, single-masted, rigged fore and aft for easy handling by a small crew, and sound in her hull if plain in her appearance. No figurehead, no carved decoration, no fresh paint, just clean timber and good cordage, and the shallow draft that shallow water work demanded. They named her informally the Revenge, with no christening ceremony beyond a shared mug of rum on the foredeck, and cleared Nassau on a morning of fair trade winds 3 days after completing the purchase. The Florida coast appeared on the third afternoon, low and featureless from seaward, the reefs marked by lines of broken water that stretched parallel to the shore in long white lines of surf. They anchored well offshore and approached the wreck sites in the sloop's small boat, joining the loose collection of salvagers already working the area. The system that had evolved among the unofficial salvagers was practically democratic in the way that Nassau's community had become democratic. Each group worked its own section, respected the markers that others had placed to indicate active sites, and divided fines according to whatever internal arrangement governed the individual crew. Edward ran his small operation with the same methodical precision he brought to every task. He marked locations with floating buoys fashioned from empty gourds. He kept a written record of every item recovered, its approximate weight, and the depth from which it had come. He rotated his two partners through the diving work so that no one became dangerously fatigued, and he ensured that every recovered item went directly into a common count before any discussion of division, removing the possibility of dispute that arose when men kept private tallies. By the end of 6 weeks on the Florida coast, the Revenge carried enough silver to refit herself completely and leave a meaningful sum in each man's hand. Edward Teach sailed back to Nassau with a vessel of his own, a tested crew of trusted partners, and the clear understanding that organization and discipline converted opportunity into reward more reliably than luck alone ever could. The Nassau that greeted Edward Teach upon his return from the Florida wrecks in the autumn of 1715 was not the same settlement he had left. The change was not subtle. Standing on the deck of the Revenge as she entered the harbour, he could see immediately that the population had roughly doubled since his departure, with new shelters extending along the beach in both directions, from the original cluster of huts and the harbour, carrying perhaps 40 vessels of various sizes, where previously there had been 20. The treasure fleet disaster had sent a signal through the entire Caribbean maritime world that a substantial reward awaited men willing to travel to Florida and work hard in shallow water. And that signal had drawn people to Nassau as the most convenient staging point. But not everyone who arrived had come specifically for the wrecks. The lawlessness of the settlement, the complete absence of any governing authority, the comfortable distance from colonial centres, the physical geography that made naval enforcement effectively impossible, had become known well beyond the circle of former privateers who had established the community in the first place. Deserters from merchant vessels arrived weekly in stolen longboats, having slipped away from their ships in the night with nothing but the clothes they were wearing. Men fleeing debts in the Carolina colonies appeared with the haunted look of people who had been running long enough that running had become their natural state. Escaped indentured servants who had endured years of near slavery on tobacco and rice plantations crossed from the mainland in dugout canoes and fishing smacks, drawn by the same promise that had drawn everyone else, a place where a man's past stayed with him only as long as he chose to carry it. The physical settlement had expanded beyond any coherent organization. The original beach had been the natural gathering point when the community was small enough that everyone knew everyone else. But it could no longer serve that function for a population approaching 1,000 souls. New cooking fires burned in clearings cut into the scrub behind the waterfront, connected to the beach by paths that had been worn through the vegetation by daily foot traffic rather than planned. Disputes over sleeping space had produced occasional violence, and the informal understanding that governed the original community you did not steal from men in the settlement. You shared information about threats. You contributed labour to collective tasks was under increasing strain from the sheer number of new arrivals who had no history with the place, and no particular investment in maintaining its social fabric. Food had become a genuine problem. The fishing grounds immediately around the island had been worked intensively enough that the catch was declining, and the small gardens of yams and plantains that earlier settlers had established could not keep pace with the increased demand. Sickness moved through the crowded shelters with the efficiency that disease always shows in conditions of poor sanitation and inadequate nutrition. Dysentery spread from contaminated water sources. Fever came from the mosquitoes that bred in the standing pools left by rain among the roots of the mangroves at the island's eastern end. Men who arrived in reasonable health sometimes left weeks later in significantly worse condition, or did not leave at all. Edward moved through this changed landscape with the characteristic attention that had always been his most reliable tool for understanding new situations. He spent his first days back walking the expanded settlement from one end to the other, noting what had changed and what had remained stable. What had remained stable was the democratic mechanism that governed decisions about collective action. The evening gatherings under the large shade tree where captains and their crews met to discuss routes, targets, and the terms of any joint operation. These gatherings continued with the same practical seriousness they had always had, and the articles that governed individual vessels remained in force for the men who signed them. The vote still decided who would captain, what course would be sailed, how prizes would be divided. This core of shared organizational principle had proved more durable than the physical conditions of the settlement, surviving the population growth and the associated strains because it delivered results that no alternative arrangement could match. Men who sailed under the articles received their shares promptly, had their injuries compensated from the common chest, and participated in decisions that directly affected their lives. These were not abstract rights. They were practical benefits that compared favourably to every other arrangement available to men in their circumstances, and the comparison was not lost on those who had experienced the alternatives. What had not remained stable was the quality of daily life ashore. The rum flowed with less regulation than before, and the consequences of that were visible in the arguments that broke out near the tavern areas after dark, and the condition of men who had been in Nassau for several months without a productive cruise to occupy their energies and replenish their funds. Benjamin Hornigold returned to Nassau while Edward was still readjusting to the changed settlement. Sailing in from a short cruise with 2 modest prizes and a crew that looked well-fed and purposeful, the 2 men met on the beach one evening with the easy recognition of people who had shared enough difficult experiences to skip the formalities that strangers required. Hornigold had aged in the years since the privateering commission, but the essential quality of his presence remained unchanged, the calculating stillness of a man who was always measuring what he observed against what he had planned. They spoke for perhaps an hour, sitting on upturned boat hulls with the harbour sounds around them, exchanging practical information about the current state of the trade routes, the movements of Spanish patrols, and the quality of the vessels now available in Nassau for anyone looking to fit out a new operation. No promises were made, no specific plans were agreed, but when they parted, both men understood that the conversation had been a beginning rather than a reunion. Edward walked back to the Revenge that evening through the expanded, complicated, increasingly lawless settlement that Nassau had become, and felt with unusual clarity the shape of what came next. The community around him was too large and too disorganized to sustain itself indefinitely without some kind of structure. The men who provided that structure, who organized the cruises, maintained the articles, kept the shares flowing, and the vessels ready for sea would determine the character of whatever this place eventually became. He intended to be one of those men. The morning Edward Teach walked down to the water's edge and signalled his intention to join Hornigold's company properly. The harbour was busy with the usual early activity men careening a brigantine on the eastern beach. a Bermudan trading sloop unloading saltfish at the makeshift wharf, 2 longboats crossing between anchored vessels with the unhurried purpose of routine resupply. Nothing about the scene suggested that a significant decision was being made at its edge. That was entirely appropriate. The most consequential choices in Edward's life had always been made quietly, without ceremony or audience, in the manner of a man who had learned early that the value of a decision lay in its execution rather than its announcement. Hornigold accepted him without the formality that the occasion might have seemed to deserve a nod, a brief exchange about the articles, and a direction to move his gear aboard before the afternoon tide. Within an hour, Edward had transferred his sea chest and his weapons from the Revenge to Hornigold's sloop and taken his place among the 42 men who formed the company. He was not starting over. He was building upward from a foundation that the Florida salvage work and the years of merchant and privateer service had already established. The men around him were a cross-section of everything the Nassau community had produced: Scots who had been pressed from fishing boats, Irishmen who had jumped ship in Barbados, Carolinians who had come south looking for something the plantation economy could not provide, and a handful of men whose origins were unclear and who preferred to keep them that way. The articles were read aloud on the main deck before the sloop cleared the harbour, a ritual that Hornigold maintained with a consistency that went beyond mere formality. Reading the articles aloud served a specific practical function. It ensured that every man who signed them had actually heard their content, removing the possibility of later claiming ignorance of a rule that had been broken. Equal shares after the captain's too, compensation from the common chest for injuries sustained in action. No striking of fellow crew members aboard ship, disputes deferred to shore settlement, votes on major decisions by the assembled company. Edward signed his name in the same place on the document that he had always signed, but with a different quality of attention than he had brought to any previous signing. He was now old enough and experienced enough to hear the articles not as a list of rules imposed from above, but as a constitutional document, a framework that distributed both power and responsibility in a way that made the company more stable than any arrangement based purely on hierarchy could have been. The captain's authority was real but bounded. He could not arbitrarily punish a man, could not keep a larger share than the articles specified, could not commit the company to a course of action that the vote had not sanctioned. In exchange, the men who sailed under him accepted a discipline that made the whole operation function. The balance was genuinely elegant, and Edward found himself appreciating its elegance more fully now than he had during the privateering years, when the articles had felt simply like better terms than the merchant service offered. The first cruise took them westward along the northern edge of the Bahama Banks in the late spring of 1716. The sloop carried 60 men on a vessel designed for perhaps 40, which meant that sleeping arrangements were tight and the cook's work was constant, but also that boarding parties could be assembled quickly and in sufficient numbers to discourage resistance without requiring actual violence. Hornigold's preferred tactics were straightforward approach under neutral colours until within hailing distance, then raise the black flag and fire a warning shot across the target's bow. The black flag itself deserves consideration. It was not at this stage the elaborate skull and crossbones design that later imagery would popularise, but simply a dark flag whose colour communicated unambiguously that the vessel flying it operated outside any national authority and expected immediate compliance from whoever it addressed. Most merchant captains, faced with an armed sloop closing rapidly and a dark flag snapping at the masthead, made the rational calculation that their cargo was worth less than their lives and struck their colours without requiring further persuasion. This was not cowardice. It was arithmetic. The first capture of the cruise confirmed the pattern. A small French coastal trader carrying salt and bolts of cloth was sighted, pursued for less than an hour, and surrendered after a single warning gun fired well clear of her hull. Edward boarded with the prize crew and conducted the inventory with the methodical precision that Hornigold had come to expect from him, noting every item in the hold and calculating its likely value in Nassau before reporting back to the captain. Over the following months, the company took 7 more prizes along the Bahama Banks and into the Florida Straits. Each capture added to the shared understanding of how the operation worked at its best approach efficiently. Secure quickly, transfer valuable cargo, release the vessel and crew with enough provisions to reach safety. Edward's role expanded with each successful action. Hornigold began sending him on particularly sensitive boarding operations. Situations where the prize captain was armed, or the crew was large enough that careless handling might produce a fight that nobody wanted. His method in these situations never varied. He went aboard without theatrical display, established eye contact with the captain immediately, and communicated through bearing and tone, rather than words, that the outcome of the encounter had already been determined, and that the only remaining question was whether the process of arriving at that outcome would be difficult or straightforward. This approach worked with remarkable consistency. It worked because it was genuine. Edward was not performing authority. He was exercising it. And the distinction was one that people felt immediately, even when they could not have articulated what they were responding to. By the end of the first extended cruise, Hornigold had made the decision that Edward had been building toward through every year of patient service since Bristol. He was given command of a captured sloop of 6 guns and 20 hands, to sail in company with the main vessel and operate as a semi-independent unit within the broader company. The promotion felt entirely natural, because it was simply the formal recognition of something that had already been true for quite some time. Command felt different from the quarterdeck. This was the first thing Edward Teach understood in the days immediately following his promotion to captain of the captured sloop that Hornigold had assigned him. Not different in a way that required adjustment to new circumstances, the practical skills of navigation, sail handling, and gun management were identical, whether a man exercised them as an officer, under someone else's authority, or as the person ultimately responsible for every decision. The difference was more fundamental than that. When a subordinate officer made a calculation and got it wrong, the consequences fell within a system that had other levels of correction available. When a captain made a calculation and got it wrong, the consequences fell on every man aboard the vessel, without filter or mitigation. This was not a theoretical observation. It was something Edward felt physically in the first few days. A heightened quality of attention that accompanied every decision regardless of its apparent scale. The trim of the sails mattered more when it was his call to make. The choice of anchorage carried different weight when 20 men depended on his judgment about whether the holding ground was reliable and the position defensible. He adapted to this heightened responsibility with the same methodical patience that had always been his most reliable response to new challenges. Establishing his watch system and his daily routines aboard the small sloop with a deliberateness that communicated to the crew from the first day that this vessel would be run with consistency and fairness in equal measure. The crew of 20 that sailed with him on the first independent operation had been drawn partly from Hornigold's existing company, and partly from men who had joined Nassau specifically because they had heard about Teach and chosen him over other available captains. This self-selection mattered. Men who chose their captain rather than being assigned to him brought a different quality of commitment to the enterprise. They had made a judgment about who to follow, and that judgment created a stake in the success of the arrangement that purely assigned crews did not always have. Edward recognized this and worked with it deliberately. He established the articles aboard the small sloop with the same ceremony that Hornigold had always observed, reading them aloud to the assembled crew, taking questions seriously, and making clear through his manner that the document was not a formality, but the actual framework within which every subsequent decision would be made. The first vote the company took was about whether to pursue a distant sail that appeared on the horizon on their 3rd day at sea. Edward presented the information he had: the vessel's approximate size, her heading, the wind conditions that would affect a chase, and stepped back from the decision. The vote was in favour of pursuit. They chased for 4 hours, and the target proved faster than expected, disappearing over the horizon as the wind freshened in her favour. No recriminations followed. No suggestion that the vote had been wrong. The company had exercised its authority and accepted the result. The process itself had value independent of the outcome. The operational pattern that developed during these months of sailing in company with Hornigold established habits that would define Edward's approach to command for the rest of his career. He positioned his smaller, fast asleep as the advance element of the pair racing ahead to investigate potential targets, assessing their speed and armament before signalling back to Hornigold with a prearranged code of flag, signals that conveyed the essential information quickly. This role suited the sloop's characteristics perfectly. She was nimble where the larger vessel was powerful, able to work in shallower water and to maneuver around the edges of a target's defensive capabilities before the main attack developed. Edward pushed her hard without pushing her carelessly, driving the crew to practice sail changes until they could go from full canvas to bare poles and back again. In the time it took a larger vessel to complete a single maneuver, he also began refining his approach to the moment of capture, developing the specific combination of presence and restraint that would become his signature. When his sloop came alongside a prize, he appeared at the rail himself rather than sending an officer tall, bearded, unhurried, with the slow matches already lit and trailing thin smoke from their coils. The effect on merchant captains seeing this figure for the first time was consistently and immediately useful. They struck their colours faster, argued less about the terms, and cooperated more fully with the boarding party's inventory work. The months of independent command also revealed unexpected dimensions of the responsibility he had accepted. Leadership at sea during the privateering years under Hornigold had been largely about following established practice with high competence. Leadership as captain of his own vessel required something additional, the continuous management of a community of men whose lives were genuinely interdependent, who spent every hour of every day within a few yards of each other in conditions that tested patience and goodwill regularly. 2 men in his crew developed a serious dispute over a gambling debt that one claimed the other had refused to honour. The articles specified that disputes were to be deferred until the company reached shore. Edward enforced this provision without taking sides, reminding both men of what they had agreed to and making clear that the rule existed not to protect the debtor, but to protect the vessel from the kind of destructive conflict that personal animosity at sea could produce. Both men accepted the ruling, grumbling but compliant, which was exactly the response the articles were designed to produce. By the end of 1717, Edward Teach had commanded his own vessel for more than a year and had produced a record of steady captures, fair divisions, and 0 serious incidents of internal conflict. Hornigold regarded him as the most reliable officer he had ever sailed with, which was high praise from a man whose standards for reliability had been tested across 3 years of Caribbean operations. The foundation was built. What came next would be built upon it, and it would be considerably larger. The 10th day of January, 1718, began like most days at sea, in the latitude of Hispaniola, a steady trade wind from the northeast, scattered cloud, and the particular clarity of Caribbean air that made distant objects appear closer than they were. Edward Teach stood at the helm of his sloop in the early morning, watching the horizon with the habitual attention of someone who had learned that the most significant things in a sailor's life usually appeared without warning at the edge of visibility. Hornigold's larger vessel held station half a mile to the north, the 2 ships maintaining the loose formation that had become their standard operating pattern during weeks of coordinated cruising through the Windward Passage. The trade between Martinique and the French Atlantic ports moved through these waters with regularity, and the 2 captains had positioned themselves to intercept the morning's most likely candidates, with the patience of men who understood that the sea rewarded systematic coverage of ground more reliably than dramatic individual initiative. When the lookout called down from the maintop at approximately 8 in the morning, his voice carried a specific quality that distinguished a routine sighting from something more interesting. The sail he had identified was large 3 masts, square-rigged on the fore and main, running before the wind with a full spread of canvas that spoke of a vessel making the most of favourable conditions. She was heading northwest, probably bound for Saint-Domingue, or perhaps running directly for the Florida Straits and the homeward passage to France. Her hull rode low, which meant she was carrying cargo. She was, by any reasonable assessment, exactly the kind of prize that justified weeks of patient waiting. Hornigold signalled by flag within minutes of the sighting being reported. The message was brief and familiar, pursue. The two vessels spread their own canvas and began closing the distance, working to cut off the larger ship's line of escape toward the south, while maintaining enough separation between themselves to prevent the target from slipping through a gap between them. Edward pushed his sloop hard, feeling the hull accelerate as additional canvas caught the trade wind and translated it into forward motion. The chase lasted approximately 2 hours, during which the larger vessel made several course adjustments as her captain identified the threat and attempted to find a heading that would use her size and the wind angle to outrun the pursuing sloops. The attempt was understandable but ultimately futile. In open water with the trade wind blowing steadily, a well-handled sloop of the type Hornigold and Teach commanded could overhaul almost any laden merchantman regardless of size. Because the advantage of carrying less weight more than compensated for the larger vessel's greater sail area, when Edward's sloop had closed to within firing range, he ran out a bow chaser and fired a single shot that passed well ahead of the larger vessel's bow, the universal signal of demand rather than attack. Intended to communicate that resistance would produce consequences, while surrender remained a dignified option. The large ship's response came within minutes. Her captain brought her into the wind, backed her main topsail, and ran up a white flag from her peak. She had surrendered without a broadside being fired. She was La Concorde, out of Nantes, 14 guns, 250 tons. Recently arrived from Guinea with a cargo of enslaved Africans delivered to the sugar planters of Martinique, and now heading home with the payment received for that cargo sugar hogsheads, indigo, and a quantity of gold dust and coin that represented the monetized value of human lives converted into colonial trade goods. Her captain, a thin man named Pierre Dosset, with the careful manner of someone accustomed to managing complex and morally ambiguous situations, handed over his papers without resistance, and asked only that his crew be allowed sufficient provisions to reach the nearest port. Edward gave the assurance immediately, and meant it. Hornigold came aboard shortly afterward, and the two captains walked the length of the prize together in a silence that was not uncomfortable but thoughtful. The silence of men evaluating something whose significance they both recognized. La Concorde was in exceptional condition. She had been careened in Martinique within the past several months. Her bottom clean and her hull sound. Her decks were well laid, her masts straight, her rigging recently replaced in several critical sections. She was, as a fighting platform, capable of carrying far more guns than her current 14. The great cabin aft was roomy enough to serve as a genuine command centre, rather than the cramped sleeping space that smaller vessels allowed. Hornigold turned to Edward on the quarterdeck and said what both men had been thinking since they first stepped aboard. This was the vessel they had been working toward without quite knowing it. The company assembled on the main deck of La Concorde that afternoon for the vote that would determine her fate. The options were presented clearly: sell her in a colonial port, strip her of useful materials and sink her, or keep her as a new flagship under Edward's command. The vote for the third option was unanimous, which was perhaps the least surprising outcome in the history of democratic decision-making aboard pirate vessels. 40 men from the combined companies immediately volunteered to transfer to the prize. Drawn by the scale of the opportunity she represented, Edward accepted them all. The work of transformation began within hours of the vote. Guns were transferred from the sloop's 6 additional carriage pieces mounted on the upper deck. Bringing the total armament to 20, and powder and shot were redistributed from both sloops to ensure the new flagship had a full magazine. The French crew was given their boat, their provisions, and their personal effects, then set on a course for the nearest inhabited island. They departed without complaint, which said something useful about the quality of the treatment they had received. The ship was renamed that evening in a brief ceremony on the quarterdeck, the choice of name carrying its own particular weight: Queen Anne's Revenge. The Queen was 3 years dead. The war that bore her name concluded 5 years earlier, but both lived on in the memory of the men who had sailed under her commission and been abandoned when peace made them inconvenient. The name was not nostalgic. It was a statement of account still outstanding. The first morning aboard the Queen Anne's Revenge as her captain, Edward Teach rose before first light and walked the length of the ship from bow to stern in the darkness, running his hands along the rail and feeling the deck's movement beneath his feet, with the deliberate attention of someone taking possession of something whose full dimensions he was still discovering. The ship was larger than anything he had previously commanded by a factor that made the comparison almost meaningless. Where his sloop had measured perhaps 30 tons and carried 20 men in conditions that allowed no private space of any kind, the Revenge measured 250 tons, carried a crew approaching 200 when the volunteers from both sloops were counted, and offered a great cabin aft that was large enough to hold a table, 3 chairs, and the charts and books that Edward had accumulated over years of careful note-taking without creating the impression of clutter. The deck was wide enough that 2 men could pass each other comfortably amidships without either stepping aside. The hold was deep enough to carry provisions for weeks at sea without the constant rationing anxiety that had characterized every previous vessel he had sailed. Standing on the quarterdeck in the pre-dawn darkness with the trade wind moving warm and steady through the rigging above him, Edward Teach felt the particular quality of satisfaction that comes not from having arrived somewhere, but from recognizing that the foundation beneath your feet is finally solid enough to build something substantial upon. The transformation of La Concorde into the Queen Anne's Revenge required several days of intensive work that occupied every man in the company simultaneously. The gun ports that the French builders had cut for 14 pieces needed modification to accommodate the 20 that the company had voted to mount, which meant carpentry work on the upper deck that the ship's carpenter supervised with the focused urgency of someone who understood that the alterations had to be structurally sound as well as quickly completed. Powder and shot were distributed through the magazine with the precision that handling explosive materials demanded, each barrel of powder stored in a specific location according to the rate of consumption expected from its associated gun. The shot separated by caliber and stacked in racks that kept it accessible during action, without allowing it to roll free in heavy weather. The rigging was checked systematically from truck to deck, with worn sections replaced from the supply taken from the French vessel's own stores and from additional cordage transferred from the 2 sloops that had made the capture possible. Edward supervised all of this work personally without taking any of it out of the hands of the men who knew it best. The carpenter directed his own repairs, the bosun managed his own rigging, the gunner organized his own magazine. The captain's role in these preparations was to maintain the overall picture, to identify dependencies between different work streams, and to make the decisions about sequence and priority that kept 20 different tasks from interfering with each other. He was good at this in the way that people are good at things they have been preparing for without fully realizing it. The separation from Hornigold came naturally, without drama or negotiation. The older captain announced his intention to return to Nassau with his original sloop and the smaller prize they had taken earlier in the cruise, wished Edward well in the direct, unsentimental manner that characterized everything about him, and left 20 additional men who had chosen to stay with the larger ship. The handshake on the quarterdeck of the Revenge was brief and entirely genuine. These were men who respected each other in the specific way that competent professionals respect other competent professionals, not with warmth exactly, but with the recognition that shared difficulty over shared time produces something that resembles trust more closely than most other human arrangements. Edward watched Hornigold's sloop until she dropped below the horizon, then turned back to the work of readying the Revenge for her first independent cruise. The course he chose was northward, toward the Carolina coast, where the trade was rich and the naval presence thin. The logic was straightforward. The major Caribbean ports, Port Royal in Jamaica, Bridgetown in Barbados, now had enough naval attention to make operations in their immediate vicinity genuinely risky. The Carolina coast offered the combination of active commercial traffic and limited enforcement that the Queen Anne's Revenge needed to establish her reputation before that reputation alone became an operational asset. Life aboard the flagship settled quickly into rhythms that Edward established with the same deliberateness he brought to every aspect of command. The daily routine began identically to every ship he had ever sailed: bilge pumps at 4 bells, galley fire, breakfast from the common pot. But the scale at which these routines operated had changed in ways that required new organizational structures to support them. Feeding 200 men 3 times a day from a single galley demanded a cook's schedule that the smaller vessels had never required. Managing a gun crew of sufficient size to serve 20 carriage pieces simultaneously required an organizational structure with multiple levels of authority beneath the captain, gun captains responsible for individual pieces, a master gunner responsible for the entire battery, a powder monkey rotation that kept the magazine flowing without creating bottlenecks during action. Edward established these structures in the first week and then deliberately stepped back from their daily operation, allowing the men he had placed in charge of specific functions to develop their own authority within their domains. The result was a ship that ran with a smoothness that visitors from other vessels consistently remarked upon. His own daily habits aboard the Revenge mirrored what they had always been. Scaled to the larger environment, he cleaned his pistols on the quarterdeck each morning in the first light, checked the slow matches in their oilskin pouch, combed and tied his beard before the watch changed. The beard had grown unchecked since the capture of La Concorde, reaching well below his chest in thick black coils that the salt air kept permanently slightly damp. He had begun, in a completely practical and unself-conscious way, to look exactly like the legend that was beginning to form around him. The slow matches were hemp cord, soaked in saltpeter solution and dried until they would burn with a steady, smokeless ember that could be maintained for hours without attention. Every gun crew aboard any vessel that carried black powder weapons kept slow matches available as a backup ignition source, coiled in a bucket of sand near the breech of each piece, ready to light the touch hole if the primary firing mechanism failed. They were purely functional objects, unglamorous tools of a working trade, no more inherently dramatic than the rammer or the sponge that completed the loading sequence. What Edward Teach did with them was take a tool that existed for one purpose and discover, through a process that appears to have been entirely practical rather than theatrical, that it served a second purpose equally well. The first time he twisted slow matches into his beard before an approach was probably not a calculated decision. It was more likely an experiment, a man with a large, dark beard and a practical understanding of how appearance affects behavior, trying something to see whether it worked. It worked immediately and comprehensively. The burning cords, tucked into the thick coils of his beard and lit just before the Revenge came within visual range of a target, produced a halo of thin smoke around his face that caught the low light of dawn or dusk and transformed his already imposing figure into something that landed in the minds of watching merchant sailors with a force that no amount of gun practice could have achieved. They saw a tall man wreathed in smoke, standing at the rail with pistols crossed at his chest, and the part of their brain responsible for immediate threat assessment told them with absolute conviction that this was not a situation in which resistance was advisable. The practical consequences were immediate and measurable. Before the slow matches became part of Edward's standard approach, the Revenge was taking prizes at a rate that reflected her firepower and speed good, but dependent on the target being close enough and slow enough to prevent escape, and occasionally requiring an actual broadside to convince a stubborn captain that his situation was genuinely hopeless. After the slow matches became routine, the surrender rate among vessels within visual range of the Revenge increased dramatically. Merchant captains, who later described their encounters to colonial authorities, consistently used language drawn from the vocabulary of the supernatural. A devil with fire in his beard, a demon standing on the rail with smoke rising from his face, a figure who seemed to burn without being consumed. These descriptions were not the exaggerations of frightened men trying to justify their swift surrenders. They were honest attempts by practical people to describe something that genuinely did not fit into any category their previous experience had given them. A burning man who was also a ship's captain, a fire that seemed to emanate from the person rather than from any external source. The cognitive disruption that this image produced in the seconds immediately after sighting was enough to prevent the kind of rapid, organized response that might have turned some encounters into genuine fights. By the time a merchant captain had processed what he was seeing and reached for a rational explanation, the Revenge was already within boarding range, and the question of resistance had been rendered academic. Edward had discovered, perhaps accidentally, one of the most effective force multipliers in the history of psychological warfare at sea. What distinguished his approach from simple theatrical display was the complete absence of performance in everything else he did. The slow matches burned. But his voice, when he spoke across the water to a surrendering captain, was the same level tone he used when discussing watch schedules with his officers. His movements on deck during an approach were deliberate and economical. The movements of someone attending to business rather than presenting himself for observation. He gave orders without raising his voice. He conducted boarding operations with the same methodical efficiency that had characterized his work under Hornigold. He treated captured crews with the consistent fairness that the articles required and his own judgment reinforced. This contrast between the genuinely alarming visual impression and the calm, businesslike reality of the encounter, once surrender had occurred, was itself a significant part of the legend's construction. Though Edward had not designed it as such, released prisoners who reached colonial ports and told their stories described not one man but two, the burning figure at the rail, and the quiet captain who gave clear orders, conducted a fair inventory, and sent them on their way with their personal effects intact. The combination was more unsettling than either element alone would have been. A violent man could be understood and categorized. A man who looked like a demon but behaved with studied reasonableness occupied a space in the imagination that was harder to file away and forget. The name Blackbeard had been circulating in Nassau since the early days of the Florida salvage work. A casual descriptive that attached itself to Edward's appearance without any deliberate encouragement on his part. He neither claimed it nor rejected it, which was entirely consistent with his broader indifference to reputation as a goal in itself. What he cared about were outcomes, surrenders that avoided fighting, captures that delivered useful goods, operations that kept the company fed and paid and ready for sea. The legend that was forming around him served those outcomes directly. By the spring of 1718, the name Blackbeard had travelled well beyond Nassau and the Caribbean ports where it had originated, carried northward by released prisoners and coastal traders who had encountered the Revenge or heard credible accounts of her operations. Newspaper reports in Boston and Williamsburg described a pirate captain of exceptional ferocity who commanded a powerful ship and left behind him a trail of surrendered vessels whose captains universally reported that they had seen no alternative to compliance. The reports were accurate in their broad outlines, even when the specific details had been improved in the retelling. What they captured correctly was the essential truth that Edward Teach had created something unusually effective, a reputation that preceded his vessel into every encounter and did a substantial portion of the tactical work before a single shot was fired. The legend was a weapon, and like all the other weapons he maintained, he kept it in good working order. There is a persistent temptation, when examining the lives of men who operated outside the law, to find in their arrangements either pure romance or pure brutality, depending on the storyteller's inclinations. The reality aboard the Queen Anne's Revenge was considerably more interesting than either version suggests. The articles that governed daily life on Edward Teach's flagship were not a romantic invention. They were a practical document produced by men who had experienced every variety of maritime authority naval impressment, merchant service under brutal captains, privateering under commission, and who had arrived, through direct experience rather than political theory, at a set of principles that addressed the specific failures of every system they had known. The naval articles of war produced discipline through fear of punishment, including flogging, hanging, and the cat o' nine tails applied for offences that a merchant captain might have ignored entirely. Merchant service produced discipline through economic dependence. A man who lost his berth in a distant port had limited options for survival, and captains who understood this exploited it without restraint. The pirate articles produced discipline through shared interest, which proved more durable than either fear or dependence, because it aligned what was good for each individual man with what was good for the company as a whole. When every man's share depended on the same successful operation, the motivation to ensure that operation succeeded was distributed equally across the entire crew rather than concentrated in the officers who would be held responsible for failure under other systems. The daily structure aboard the Revenge reflected this underlying principle at every level of detail. The watch system divided the crew into rotating groups that ensured continuous coverage of all essential shipboard functions without exhausting any individual man through extended duty. 4 hours on, 8 hours off during normal cruising, with all hands called for manoeuvres that required the full company. The cook served from the common pot at fixed times, with portions measured by the quartermaster to ensure that the man who arrived at the galley first received the same quantity as the man who arrived last. This sounds simple. On a vessel carrying 200 men of widely varying physical size, temperament, and social background, maintaining genuinely equal portions required vigilance and occasionally the quiet intervention of a senior hand who noticed a discrepancy before it became a grievance. Edward made the rounds of the mess himself during the first weeks aboard the Revenge. Not ostentatiously, but regularly enough that the crew understood that the captain's attention extended to the details of their daily existence rather than stopping at the level of navigation and combat. He ate the same food himself, taking his portion from the common pot at the same time as the men, which communicated through action rather than declaration that the equality written into the articles was intended to be actual rather than nominal. His 2 captains' shares came in the division of prize money, not in the daily rations, and the distinction mattered to the crew in ways that no speech could have achieved. The compensation system for injuries deserves particular attention because it represented something genuinely unusual in the 18th century maritime world. 600 pieces of 8 for the loss of a right arm, 500 for a left, 400 for a leg, 200 for an eye or a finger. These sums came from the common chest before any prize money was divided, which meant that every man in the company contributed proportionally to the compensation of every injured man. The system acknowledged a fundamental reality that merchant and naval service both preferred to ignore, that the risks of maritime work fell entirely on the men who performed it, while the rewards of those risks were distributed upward to owners, officers, and shareholders who rarely set foot on the deck where the danger actually existed. By creating a collective insurance mechanism funded by the collective's prize earnings, the articles converted individual catastrophic risk into a shared responsibility that every man could survive financially, if not physically. When a gunner lost 2 fingers to a recoiling piece during practice and received his compensation from the chest that same evening, the effect on the remaining crew was worth considerably more than the 600 pieces of 8 the articles specified. It demonstrated that the system worked exactly as described, without requiring the injured man to petition, to wait, or to prove that his injury had been sustained in the line of duty. The articles said it happened automatically, and it happened automatically. Trust in a written agreement is built through exactly these moments of specific, prompt fulfillment. The social texture of life aboard the Revenge reflected the genuinely diverse origins of the men who had signed the articles. English sailors from Bristol and Liverpool worked alongside Scots from the northern fishing ports, Irishmen from Munster and Ulster, men from the colonies whose backgrounds included everything from failed tobacco farming to escaped indentured servitude. Several men of African origin had joined from captured vessels, choosing to sign the articles rather than return to the plantation economies from which some of them had previously escaped. The articles made no distinction between these men in matters of share or duty. A man's position in the company depended on his skill with rope, gun, or navigation, and the accidents of birth that determined so much of life ashore ceased to function as organizing principles once the vessel cleared the harbour. This did not produce utopian harmony. Men with different backgrounds carried different assumptions about how the world worked, and those assumptions produced friction in the ordinary daily interactions of people living in close proximity under stress. But the articles provided a mechanism for resolving friction that was both fair and fast enough to prevent grievances from accumulating into genuine conflict. Disputes were acknowledged, deferred to shore settlement where required, and in the meantime managed through the practical requirement that every man on a vessel at sea needed every other man to perform his function. The interdependence was total and concrete in a way that made abstracted social divisions considerably less important than whether the man beside you could tie a bowline in the dark during a gale. Evening on the Revenge carried its own particular quality, the watch changing quietly, a fiddle playing somewhere forward, the smell of tobacco drifting aft on the trade wind, and 200 men living under rules they had chosen for themselves in the only place in the Atlantic world where that choice was genuinely available. The alliance that formed between Edward Teach and 2 other captains operating out of Nassau in the autumn of 1717 was not a formal arrangement in any legal sense. There was no document, no hierarchy of command, and no obligation that survived beyond the immediate convenience of the parties involved. What it was instead was a practical recognition that coordinated action produced results that individual vessels operating independently could not match. The 2 captains who joined the Queen Anne's Revenge for extended operations brought different qualities to the partnership. Stede Bonnet was an unlikely figure in the Caribbean pirate world, a Barbadian landowner and former military officer who had apparently abandoned a prosperous plantation life to go to sea, for reasons that contemporaries found baffling and that historians have speculated about ever since. He was not, by most accounts, a natural sailor. He had purchased his vessel rather than capturing it, which was itself unusual enough to mark him as an outsider to the culture of men who had built their situations through years of maritime work. His crew respected him adequately without the deep loyalty that came from shared hardship over time. The second captain, a man named Richards who had arrived in Nassau from Jamaica with a fast sloop and a crew of experienced hands, was a more conventional figure, competent, reliable, and entirely focused on the practical business of capturing prizes without drawing unnecessary attention from naval patrols. Together, the 3 vessels formed a squadron that could cover a substantial area of ocean while maintaining enough concentration to overwhelm any merchant target they identified. The operational mechanics of the loose fleet required constant communication and occasional compromise between captains whose individual authority was absolute within their own companies, but who had no formal power over each other's decisions. Edward had the largest vessel and the heaviest armament, which gave him a natural centrality in the planning conversations that the 3 captains held by boat when anchored together in the evenings. But he exercised this centrality with deliberate restraint, understanding that the voluntary nature of the alliance was its greatest strength and its most obvious vulnerability simultaneously. Men who joined because they chose to would leave for the same reason, and a captain who confused the size of his ship with the scope of his authority over other free companies would find himself sailing alone within weeks. The planning conversations consequently took the form of genuine exchanges of information and opinion, rather than briefings at which a superior communicated decisions to subordinates. Each captain described what his vessel had observed, what intelligence about trade routes he had gathered from released prisoners or from sailors who had come through Nassau recently, and what targets he considered worth pursuing. The group then worked toward consensus about where to focus the next period of operations, leaving each captain free to act independently if a specific opportunity arose that the agreed strategy had not anticipated. The arrangement was loose enough to accommodate individual judgment and tight enough to produce coordinated action when coordination was what the situation required. The campaigns through the Windward Passage and south toward the waters off Hispaniola and Puerto Rico produced a consistent flow of captures during the autumn months of 1717. A French snow-carrying wine and brandy yielded to the combined presence of all 3 vessels without a shot being fired. The sight of the Queen Anne's Revenge approaching with 20 guns run out, flanked by 2 fast sloops positioned to cut off escape in either direction, was an argument sufficiently complete that no additional persuasion was required. A Spanish packet from Havana carrying correspondence and coin took slightly longer to convince, her captain attempting to use a favourable wind shift to run for the Cuban coast before Richard's sloop cut off the angle and forced her to heave to. The silver from the packet was divided among the 3 companies according to a formula that Edward had proposed, and the other captains had accepted shares proportional to the number of men in each company, with a modest additional allocation for the vessel that had made the decisive manoeuvre that prevented escape. The formula was designed to align incentives correctly, ensuring that captains who contributed actively to a capture received recognition for that contribution without creating a competitive atmosphere that would undermine the cooperative purpose of the alliance. It worked cleanly on this occasion, with no disputes arising from the division, which was the best evidence available that the formula had been correctly designed. Between captures, the daily routines of the three vessels continued independently while maintaining enough proximity to support each other if a naval patrol appeared. Edward kept the Revenge on a loose circular pattern that covered the most active shipping lanes without exposing the larger ship to the risk of being caught in shallow water by a faster adversary. He continued the daily gun drills that had characterized the ship's routine since her capture, adding boarding practice sessions in which the crew rehearsed the transition from ship to ship under varying conditions of weather and relative motion. These drills were not theatrical preparations for a specific anticipated engagement, but genuine maintenance of a perishable skill set that degraded quickly when not regularly practiced. A boarding party that had not drilled for several weeks moved with the hesitation of people who were remembering what to do rather than doing what they knew. Edward had seen the difference during his years under Hornigold and was determined that the Revenge's company would always operate in the second mode rather than the first. The wider political situation continued to develop in ways that reached the fleet only as distant rumour, but that Edward tracked with careful attention. London had begun discussing the problem of the Nassau pirates in terms that suggested a response was being formulated. Though no ships had yet appeared to implement whatever that response might be, colonial governors in Virginia and the Carolinas were writing increasingly urgent letters about disrupted trade. The Spanish were protesting through diplomatic channels. The alliance of three vessels continued its operations through these gathering pressures, with the equanimity of men who had decided that the future would arrive when it arrived, and that the present demanded their full attention. In the meantime, fever moved through a ship the way fire moved through dry timber, slowly at first. Then, with a speed that outpaced any response the crew could mount. By the spring of 1718, the Queen Anne's Revenge had been at sea for months without a proper resupply of medical stores, and the cumulative effect of that absence was becoming visible in the forecastle, where a growing number of men lay in their hammocks with the particular stillness of people whose bodies were fighting a battle that consumed all available energy and left nothing for anything else. The ship's surgeon, a former naval man named Garrett who had joined the company in Nassau, reported to Edward with increasing urgency that his supplies of quinine, Jesuit's bark, and the basic materials needed for wound care and fever management were effectively exhausted. What the sick men needed was not available on any uninhabited quay or from any passing fishing vessel. It existed in quantity only in the well-stocked apothecaries and merchant warehouses of major colonial ports, the same ports whose governors and merchants had spent the past year writing angry letters to London about the disruptions caused by the pirates of the Bahamas. The irony was direct and entirely practical. The resources required to maintain the health of men who had been disrupting colonial trade could only be obtained from the colonies whose trade they had been disrupting. Edward gathered his officers in the great cabin, explained the situation with the same factual directness he brought to every operational briefing, and asked for suggestions. The discussion was brief. The conclusion was unanimous. They would go to Charleston. Charlestown in South Carolina was in 1718, the most significant port between Virginia and the Caribbean, handling the rice, indigo, and naval stores that formed the backbone of the Carolina plantation economy, and maintaining regular commercial connections with London, Bristol, and the major West Indian trading ports. Its harbour was accessible through a bar at the mouth of the Cooper and Ashley rivers, whose shallow draft excluded the largest ocean-going vessels, and whose approaches were marked by the kinds of shoals and current variations that required local knowledge to navigate safely. The town behind the harbour was a prosperous collection of brick and timber buildings housing perhaps 4,000 souls, with a small fort, a church, several taverns of varying respectability, and a merchant community whose wealth was visible in the quality of the houses that lined the principal streets back from the waterfront. Governor Robert Johnson administered the colony from a residence that reflected the seriousness with which London took the Carolina Proprietary, and the small council he consulted on matters of public concern represented the planter and merchant interests that actually ran the colony's daily affairs. On the 22nd of May, 1718, the Queen Anne's Revenge and her two consort sloops crossed the bar and anchored in a position that placed them directly across the main channel into the harbour. No black flag was flown initially. The three vessels simply sat there, their gun ports closed, but their presence unmistakable, blocking the passage that every vessel entering or leaving Charlestown needed to use. The effect was immediate. Several ships that had been preparing to depart found their departure suddenly inadvisable. Others that had been approaching from seaward altered course when they saw the configuration of vessels blocking the entrance and made for alternative anchorages to wait for clarification. Local pilots and curious merchants rowed out under improvised flags of truce within hours of the blockade's establishment, and Edward received them on the quarterdeck with the calm courtesy that characterized all his dealings with people who were not actively threatening him. He explained the situation plainly. His company required a chest of specific medicines, quinine, Jesuits' bark, bondage, surgical instruments, and a number of additional items that Garrett had specified in a written list, along with food and water for the sick men currently unable to perform their duties. In exchange for the delivery of these supplies, all vessels currently in the harbour would be permitted to depart unmolested. The blockade would be lifted without further interference, and no action would be taken against the town or its inhabitants. Samuel Wragg, a prominent merchant and member of the Governor's Council, who had been aboard one of the small vessels caught at anchor when the blockade began, was retained as a guarantee that the terms would be honoured from the colonial side. He was treated with complete courtesy during his brief captivity, eating from the same table as Edward's officers and suffering no indignity beyond the inconvenience of being somewhere he had not chosen to be. Governor Johnson's council met in emergency session and debated their options with the urgency the situation demanded. The fort's guns could not reach the anchored pirate vessels. The colony had no warships of its own. Sending to Jamaica or Virginia for naval assistance would take weeks that the blockaded merchants could not afford to wait. The calculations were straightforward, and the conclusion was unpleasant, but unavoidable. They would meet the demand. A sloop came out on the third day carrying everything on Garrett's list, along with additional provisions that Edward had not specifically requested, but accepted without comment, casks of fresh water, live cattle, hogs, and sheep that would provide the company with fresh meat for weeks. The supplies were transferred to the Revenge under a working arrangement that both sides maintained with professional efficiency. Wragg and the other retained passengers were released once the transfer was complete. Edward signalled his consorts. The anchors were weighed, and the three vessels stood out to sea as the late afternoon light turned the harbour copper and gold behind them. The entire operation had taken 5 days and had been accomplished without a single exchange of fire, without injury to any person on either side, and without any violation of the terms Edward had proposed at the outset. The story that reached Boston newspapers within a fortnight described a pirate blockade of breathtaking audacity, a city of 4,000 souls, held to ransom by a man with a burning beard and a ship full of sick sailors who needed medicine. The audacity was real. The violence, notably, was not. The weeks following the Charleston blockade carried a quality of aftermath that Edward Teach recognized from other moments in his career when a significant operation had concluded and the immediate pressure that had organized, everyone's energy suddenly released. The company was healthy again. Garrett's medicines had produced visible improvement in the sick men within days of the supplies arriving aboard, and the fresh livestock taken from Charleston provided meat that restored colour to faces that had been grey with fever for weeks. The consort sloops were in good repair. The Revenge herself was riding well, her hull sound after the careful maintenance that Edward had always insisted upon. By any objective measure, the fleet was in the best condition it had achieved since the capture of La Concorde, and the most audacious operation of Edward's career had concluded without violence or significant loss. Yet something in his calculations had shifted during the Charleston days in a way that he could not easily articulate, but that influenced every decision he made in the weeks that followed. The blockade had worked precisely because it had been contained a specific demand, a specific target, a clear endpoint, but it had also demonstrated, more clearly than any previous operation, exactly how visible the Queen Anne's Revenge had become. A ship of her size and reputation could not move along the Carolina coast without being noticed and reported. The network of colonial communications that had carried word of the blockade to Boston within a fortnight would carry word of any subsequent operation with equal speed. The window in which the Revenge could operate freely was narrowing, and Edward could feel the pressure of its edges even when the horizon showed nothing but open water. He chose Topsail Inlet near what is now Beaufort, North Carolina, as the careening site, guided by local knowledge obtained from pilots captured during the coastal cruising that had followed Charleston. The inlet was narrow and navigable only by vessels with local knowledge of its shifting channel, which made it defensible against casual intrusion and safe from the approach of larger naval vessels that drew more water than the inlets of the Outer Banks permitted. The work of careening, hauling the Revenge onto her side on the beach to expose the hull below the waterline for cleaning and recorking required calm weather, a suitable beach, and enough hands to manage the elaborate arrangement of anchors, lines, and shorefast tackles that controlled the process. Edward organised the operation with his usual methodical care, positioning the two consort sloops to provide security, while the flagship was vulnerable, and establishing a system of lookout posts on the dunes above the inlet to give advance warning of any approaching vessel. The first day of careening went well. The starboard side of the hull was exposed, and the carpenters worked steadily, burning off the accumulated weed and barnacles that slowed the ship's passage through the water, recorking the seams that had worked loose during months of hard service, and replacing several sections of copper sheathing that had been damaged by the grounding on coral heads that unavoidably accompanied Caribbean operations. It was routine work, necessary and unspectacular, the kind of maintenance that kept wooden ships alive. The squall arrived on the second morning with the particular combination of speed and severity that the Carolina coast produced in early summer, building offshore overnight and sweeping inward with winds that went from manageable to dangerous in less than an hour. The Revenge, heeled over on the beach with her keel exposed and her ballast shifted to maintain the angle, was in the worst possible position to weather a sudden blow. The lines holding her in the careened position came under loads they had not been designed for. The tackles began to slip. Edward organised every available man to manage the lines, and attempt to right the ship before the combination of wind pressure and uncontrolled movement drove her harder onto the bottom. But the forces working against them were larger than the forces available to resist. The hull ground against the sand with sounds that the carpenters recognised immediately as structural damage. The distinctive groan of planking moving against frames in ways that planking was not designed to move. The crack of a knee breaking under loading that exceeded its calculated limit. When the squall passed and the damage could be properly assessed, the picture was clear and unambiguous. The Queen Anne's Revenge was not going to sea again in any useful time frame. Several guns had gone overboard in the confusion. The hull damage below the waterline was extensive enough that repairs would require resources and facilities that Topsail Inlet could not provide. Edward gathered the company and explained the situation with the directness that the articles required and his own temperament preferred. The flagship was lost. The usable stores, weapons, and powder would be transferred to the two consort sloops. The company would divide, with those who wished to seek other arrangements free to do so, and those who wished to continue with Edward sailing in the smaller vessels that remained. The response was practical and without visible anguish. These were men who had learned through years of maritime experience that attachment to any specific vessel was a luxury that the sea did not permit. The transfer of stores took 2 days. Working methodically through the holds of the Revenge and deciding item by item what was worth taking and what must be left. When it was done, the flagship that had sailed from the capture of La Concorde through the Charleston blockade sat stripped and grounded at the edge of Topsail Inlet, her gun ports empty, her rigging slack. Edward did not linger over the sight. He had already begun calculating the next move. Governor Charles Eden of North Carolina had a reputation for pragmatism, a quality that the circumstances now required above all others. The royal proclamation, offering pardons to pirates who surrendered before a specified date, remained in force. Bathtown was 3 days' sail up the Sound. Edward gave the order to weigh anchor and shaped a course toward the only form of official legitimacy that was currently available to him, carrying with him the same quiet calculation that had guided every transition in his life since Bristol. Bathtown, in the summer of 1718, was not a place that announced itself with any particular drama. Arriving by water from the Sound, a traveller saw first the low shoreline of the creek mouth, then a scattering of wooden buildings set back from the landing, among trees whose shade was the most immediately welcome feature of the landscape. After weeks aboard a vessel with no shelter from the Carolina summer sun, perhaps 30 houses stood in Bath at this time, ranging from the modest frame structures of artisans and small traders to the slightly more substantial residences of the planters and officials who formed the colony's thin layer of local authority. A church occupied a cleared lot near the centre of the settlement, its wooden walls still smelling of fresh-cut timber. A tavern near the landing served as the community's informal gathering point, its common room perpetually crowded in the evenings with men whose conversations covered the full range of colonial preoccupations, land prices, crop condition, the difficulty of obtaining manufactured goods from England at rates that left any margin of profit, and the chronic weakness of an administration that seemed to London like a manageable dependency, and from the inside like a collection of competing interests held together by shared geography rather than any deeper coherence. Governor Charles Eden received Edward Teach in his frame house near the water with the unhurried courtesy of a man who had learned that colonial administration required flexibility as much as principle, and who had been in the position long enough to distinguish between the two without much internal conflict. The pardon was granted with a speed that reflected both the legal straightforwardness of the royal proclamation and Eden's personal calculation that a former pirate captain settled quietly in Bathtown was considerably less troublesome than one who remained at sea. Edward paid the required fees, made the required declarations, and walked back to the landing as a man whose past had been officially set aside by the authority of a distant crown that had decided its interests were better served by amnesty than prosecution. He rented a small house on the edge of the settlement that same afternoon, a one-story frame structure with a shingled roof, 2 rooms, a hearth large enough to cook over, and a window at the back that looked across a cleared area toward the tree line. The building had belonged to a merchant who had moved north the previous year, leaving it available at a rate that suggested the owner was more interested in receiving something for the property than in holding out for full value. Edward moved in his sea chest, his pistols, his remaining personal effects, and the notebook he had maintained since his merchant days, and spent the first evening sitting in the doorway, watching the light change over the creek with the quality of attention that very different circumstances could produce in the same person, the watchfulness of a sailor reading weather, translated into the watchfulness of a man reading an unfamiliar kind of stillness. The rhythms of ordinary life in Bathtown were unlike anything Edward had experienced since his earliest years in Bristol, and even that comparison was imperfect, because Bristol's ordinary life had been organised around the harbour in a way that Bathtown's was not. Here the daily sounds were different chickens in adjacent yards, the blacksmith's hammer from the workshop 3 houses down, the creak of a wagon on the unpaved track that served as the settlement's main thoroughfare, the occasional distant report of a hunting musket from the woods beyond the cleared land. He rose early from habit, walked down to the landing each morning to check on the sloop that still lay at anchor in the creek, and returned to the small house to prepare a breakfast that bore no resemblance to shipboard food: fresh cornbread baked over the hearth, smoked ham from a neighbouring farmer who sold provisions to anyone who would pay, oysters gathered at low tide from the mud flats at the creek's edge, eaten raw with the faint salt taste that was the only flavour connecting them to the sea he had left temporarily behind. Neighbours visited without announcing themselves, in the casual manner of small settlements where everyone's business was known and the social distance between people of different stations was compressed by proximity and mutual dependence. A planter whose land bordered the town came to introduce himself and stayed for an hour discussing the difficulty of getting indigo to market when the ships that called at the nearest deep-water port kept irregular schedules. A woman who sold mended sails and small domestic goods from a stall near the church stopped to examine the quality of the patch Edward had put on a torn piece of canvas and approved it with the authority of genuine expertise. The dinners at Governor Eden's table were the most formally social occasions that Bathtown offered, and Edward attended the 3 to which he was invited during his months ashore with the composed attention of someone who understood that these gatherings served a function beyond the food and conversation they provided. Eden's secretary, Tobias Knight, was present at each dinner, a careful, literate man who handled the colony's correspondence with London and who seemed genuinely curious about Edward's accounts of Caribbean geography and the trade routes that connected the island colonies to the mainland. Edward offered what information served the conversation without revealing anything that might compromise the men who had sailed with him. A balance he maintained without apparent effort throughout the ashore period. The cleared plot of land outside town that he hired a local man to prepare for spring planting represented the most concrete expression of the settled life. He was experimentally inhabiting actual earth that could theoretically produce actual crops that could be sold to actual neighbours in a cycle of productive domesticity that was entirely unlike anything his previous life had contained. He walked the plot each morning after checking the sloop, feeling the turned soil under his boots and considering what it meant to own ground that stayed where it was regardless of wind or tide. It was not an unpleasant feeling. It was simply, he discovered gradually, a feeling that belonged to a different version of himself than the one that stood at the quarterdeck rail in the early morning watching the horizon for sails. The decision crystallized on a morning in early October when Edward walked down to the landing at first light and stood looking at the sloop for longer than the routine inspection required. The vessel rode quietly at her anchor in the still water of the creek, her hull reflecting the pale early sky and the surface around her waterline, her single mast describing a small arc against the tree line behind the town as the gentle current moved her on her cable. She was in good condition. He had seen to that during the months in Bathtown, visiting every few days to check the caulking and the standing rigging, and the condition of the provisions stored in her small hold against the possibility of a departure that he had not yet formally acknowledged he was planning. The men who had remained with the sloop through the ashore period were still there, a core group of a dozen who had proved during the months of relative inactivity that they preferred the proximity of the vessel and the possibility it represented to the settled routines of the town. They had fished, repaired gear, and waited with the patient equanimity of sailors who understood that waiting was simply another form of seamanship. When Edward arrived at the landing that October morning and stayed longer than usual, one of them looked up from the splice he was working and met his captain's eyes without speaking. The look communicated everything that needed communicating. They would sail with the next tide. The preparations took 2 days, during which Edward moved through Bathtown with the combination of efficiency and deliberate casualness that characterized his approach to transitions whose announcement would serve no useful purpose. He settled his accounts with the farmer who had supplied provisions, paid the man he had hired to clear the land outside town for work that would now go unfinished through the winter, and returned the key to the house to the owner's representative in the next settlement north without explanation or ceremony. He did not call on Governor Eden before leaving, a decision that reflected not discourtesy, but the simple reality that there was nothing useful to say. The pardon remained technically in force. Edward was not renouncing it. He was simply returning to an environment where it was less immediately relevant than it had been during the months ashore. The distinction was fine enough that articulating it to a colonial governor would have required more honesty about intentions than the situation demanded. He loaded the sloop with provisions sufficient for 3 weeks at sea salt pork, cornmeal, fresh water from the creek spring, and a modest supply of rum distributed the weapons from his sea chest back to their working positions, and checked the slow matches in their oilskin pouch with the same morning ritual he had maintained since the early days on the Revenge. The sloop cleared the creek mouth on the morning tide of the 9th of October, 1718. With 25 hands aboard the original core group, supplemented by men from the town who had come to the landing the previous evening, having somehow learned that a departure was imminent, and having decided that the sea suited them better than Bath County's quiet routines, Edward accepted those whose skills justified their presence and declined the two who appeared at the landing with no evident maritime experience and the slightly wild look of men who were fleeing something specific rather than choosing something positive. The vessel moved out through the Sound with the familiar feeling of a life resuming its natural form after a period of interruption. The deck beneath his feet had the particular responsiveness of a well-maintained hull, answering the pressure of wind and current, without the slight deadness that waterlogged or weed-fouled planking produced. The sloop was fast and handy in the shallow waters of the Outer Banks, capable of working through channels that would ground any pursuing vessel of significant size, and her crew knew her well enough to extract her full performance without the learning period that accompanied a new command. The black flag went up on the morning of the third day out, raised without ceremony as the first sail of the cruise came into view on the northern horizon, a Virginia coaster making southward with a cargo that her trim suggested was heavy and therefore valuable. The pattern re-established itself with the naturalness of something returning to its proper form. Approach under no colours until close enough for the merchant captain to read the situation correctly. Black flag raised at the moment when raising it would be most effective, close enough to be unmistakable, far enough away that the target had time to process the information and arrive at the correct conclusion before panic replaced judgment. Warning shot across the bow. Aim to pass close enough to be felt as a concussion, rather than merely seen as a splash. Surrender. In almost every case. Within minutes of the warning shot, boarding, inventory, transfer of useful cargo, release of the vessel with sufficient provisions for her crew to reach the nearest port. The Virginia coaster carried barrel staves and dried fish, heading for the Carolina settlements, not spectacular goods, but useful ones that would extend the sloop's provisions and could be traded at favourable rates in Nassau if the cruise extended that far south. Edward divided the take according to the articles the same evening, with each man receiving his share in goods rather than coin. The proportions measured by the quartermaster under the open sky, where every hand could observe the count. The division took less than an hour. No disputes arose. The company sailed on with the practical satisfaction of people who had done what they came to do and been fairly compensated for doing it. The political pressures that had been building during the Bathtown months were not visible on the open water of the Carolina Sounds, but Edward tracked them through the intelligence that every captured captain carried without realizing he was carrying it. Released prisoners talked, and the men they talked to talked further, and the information that reached Edward through this chain described a Virginia governor whose patience with North Carolina's leniency had exhausted itself completely. Alexander Spotswood had been gathering names, routes, and operational details for months from merchants and captains who had encountered the sloop or heard reliable accounts of her movements. He had written to London requesting authorization for independent action. He had begun consulting with naval officers about the practical challenges of operating in the shallow waters of the Carolina Sounds. The intelligence was clear enough in its outlines that Edward could see the shape of what was coming even without knowing its specific timing. He kept the sloop moving, varying her pattern along the coast between the Virginia Capes and the Carolina Sounds, never staying in any single area long enough for a pursuit to organize around a fixed position. He careened briefly in a secluded inlet south of Ocracoke, bottom scraped and recaulked by the crew in a single long day of hard work, and then moved on before the smoke of their fire had fully dispersed. The sea remained the same as it had always been, indifferent to the political forces organizing themselves ashore, offering the same combination of freedom and danger that it had offered since the first morning he stood on a Bristol quay and understood that the horizon was a direction rather than a boundary. Alexander Spotswood had been governor of Virginia since 1710, appointed by the Crown with a military background that distinguished him from the lawyers and merchants who typically filled colonial administrative posts. He had served as a soldier in the War of the Spanish Succession, been wounded at the Battle of Blenheim, and carried into his colonial appointment the specific habits of mind that military experience produces in men who survive it: a preference for decisive action over prolonged negotiation, a tendency to assess problems in terms of force and terrain rather than politics and persuasion, and a deep impatience with the kind of jurisdictional ambiguity that allowed problems to persist when the resources to solve them were theoretically available. He had watched the situation along the Carolina coast develop for months, with the controlled frustration of a man who knows exactly what needs to be done and cannot do it because the authority required belongs to someone else. North Carolina's Governor Eden had granted Teach a pardon that Spotswood considered not merely misguided but actively complicit in the continuation of a problem that was costing Virginia merchants real money on a weekly basis. The intelligence that accumulated on his desk through the autumn of 1718 described a man who had accepted the pardon, spent several months in Bathtown in a performance of reformed behaviour, and then returned to sea with the same crew, the same vessel, and the same articles that had governed his operations for years. Spotswood read these reports with the expression of a man whose working hypothesis has been confirmed by events he had predicted and been unable to prevent. The legal situation required careful navigation before any action could be taken. Spotswood had no authority over North Carolina, whose governance fell under a separate colonial charter that placed it beyond the reach of Virginia's administrative apparatus, regardless of how much the two colonies' commercial interests overlapped. He could not order Eden to act, could not send Virginia forces into North Carolina waters without risking a jurisdictional confrontation that London would find embarrassing, and could not rely on the Royal Navy to respond quickly to a request for assistance that would need to travel to London and back before producing ships in the Chesapeake. What he could do, and what he decided to do with the methodical thoroughness of a military officer planning an operation rather than a colonial administrator requesting assistance, was use the resources already available in Virginia waters. 2 small sloops of war were stationed in the Chesapeake under his nominal authority, vessels that carried light armament but experienced crews drawn from Virginia militia and local sailors who knew the coastal waters intimately. They were not powerful ships. Against the Queen Anne's Revenge they would have been suicide. Against a single fast sloop carrying 25 men in the shallow waters of the Carolina Sounds, they were exactly sufficient for the task, provided the planning was careful and the execution was quick. The officer Spotswood selected to lead the operation was Lieutenant Robert Maynard, a naval officer serving on half-pay in the Chesapeake, who had come to Spotswood's attention through the recommendation of a senior naval captain who described him as the kind of man who finished what he started. Maynard was in his early 30s, lean and deliberate in the manner of someone who had learned through experience that the difference between a successful engagement and a disastrous one usually came down to preparation rather than courage, since courage was a commodity that both sides in any fight generally possessed in sufficient supply. Spotswood briefed him in person at the governor's residence in Williamsburg, spreading charts of the Carolina Sounds across the table and explaining the intelligence picture with the precision of a man who had been studying the problem for months. Teach's likely position was Ocracoke Inlet, where multiple sources had placed the sloop in recent weeks. The inlet's geography offered advantages to the defender shallow water: a narrow entrance channel, multiple anchorages behind the bar where a vessel could sit watching the approaches without being visible from seaward. It also offered an advantage to a well-planned attacking force, because the same shallow water that excluded large naval vessels would not exclude Maynard's small sloops, and the narrow channel meant that a fast approach at the right moment would give the anchored vessel insufficient room to maneuver away from engagement. Maynard spent 3 days preparing his force with the careful attention to detail that distinguished professional military planning from improvised response. The 2 sloops Jane and Ranger were examined for any defects in hull or rigging that might compromise their performance at a critical moment, and the deficiencies found were corrected immediately. The crews were drilled in boarding tactics every morning, rehearsing the specific sequence of actions that would follow grappling alongside an armed vessel in close water. Who went first, who followed, what each man's specific assignment was in the first 30 seconds after crossing the rail. Weapons were inspected, cleaned, and loaded. Extra pistols were issued from the arms stores. Grenades, small explosive devices, whose effect in a confined deck space was more psychological than physical, but whose psychological effect was considerable, were prepared and distributed to the boarding party leaders. Spotswood provided written orders that authorized Maynard to engage Teach in any waters where he found him, including the sounds of North Carolina, and a copy of the royal proclamation that had been issued against pirates who had not accepted their pardons or had subsequently returned to piracy after accepting them. The reward structure was specific and substantial: £100 for Teach himself, smaller but significant sums for his officers, and a flat rate per head for ordinary crew members delivered alive for trial. On the 17th of November, 1718, the two sloops cleared Kecoughtan on the Virginia side of the Chesapeake, their colours flying, their crews fed and armed and ready, heading south along the coast toward the inlet, where Edward Teach had chosen to rest between cruises in the comfortable certainty that the shallow water around him provided protection that no reasonable threat could overcome. The 22nd of November, 1718, broke clear over Ocracoke Inlet, with the particular quality of light that the Carolina coast produced in late autumn sharp and pale, the sun still low over the eastern horizon, the Sound lying flat and colourless in the early morning air. Edward Teach had returned to the sloop before first light after a night ashore with a small party around a driftwood fire on the beach, where the conversation had been the ordinary kind that men have when they are comfortable in their circumstances and not expecting the immediate future to differ significantly from the recent past. The discussion had turned to provisions, what was needed, where it might be obtained, and to the condition of the sloop's running rigging, which the boatswain had reported needed attention at the forethroat halyard before the next extended cruise. These were the concerns of a man running a working vessel with professional competence. They were not the concerns of a man who believed he was spending his last night ashore. Edward climbed back to the sloop's deck in the pre-dawn darkness, checked the anchor cable with his hand to confirm the vessel had not dragged in the night, and stood for a moment at the rail looking across the Sound toward the inlet entrance. The water was calm. The few stars still visible were fading against a sky that was beginning to lighten in the east. Nothing on the horizon suggested that the day would be different from any other day in the Ocracoke anchorage. He went below to the small cabin and slept for 2 hours. The lookout's call came at approximately 8 in the morning. 2 sloops crossing the bar under British colours, moving with the purposeful speed of vessels that had identified their destination and were committed to reaching it. Edward was on deck within seconds of the call, his instincts carrying him from the cabin to the quarterdeck before conscious thought had fully assembled the situation. He looked at the approaching vessels for perhaps 10 seconds, long enough to assess their size, their armament, the number of men visible on their decks, and the quality of intent communicated by the angle and speed of their approach. The assessment was immediate and accurate. These were not merchant vessels. They were not vessels whose captains had entered the inlet by mistake or were seeking shelter from weather. They were organised, well manned, and coming directly for the sloop with the specific directedness of people who knew exactly where they were going and why. He ordered the black flag hoisted and the company to their stations. The men responded with the automatic efficiency of long-practiced gun crews to their pieces, boarders to the rail with weapons ready, the helmsman to the wheel with the anchor cable already being cut rather than weighed, because speed now mattered more than the anchor that had held them safely through the previous weeks. Edward took the helm himself, feeling the sloop begin to answer as the freed cable dropped away and the trade wind from the northeast pressed against the hastily raised canvas. The geography of the anchorage worked against him in ways that became apparent within the first minutes of the engagement. The Sound behind the inlet was shallow and the channels through it narrow, threading between sandbars that shifted with every significant storm, and that only men with detailed local knowledge could navigate at speed without grounding. The sloop drew less water than Maynard's vessels, which gave her a theoretical advantage in the shoaless sections, but the light wind of the early morning gave her less manoeuvrability than she needed to exploit that advantage decisively. Maynard's Jane was closing from the southwest, cutting off the most obvious escape route toward the deeper water of the Pamlico Sound. The Ranger was angling to cover the northeastern approach. The geometry was competent and deliberate, the work of a man who had studied the inlet's configuration before entering it, and had positioned his two vessels to reduce the available escape corridors to zero before the action began. Maynard hailed across the water when the Jane was within shouting distance, demanding surrender in the name of the king. Edward's response came from the quarterdeck in the same level tone he had used for every significant announcement of his career. He would give no quarter and expected none. The words were not bravado. They were a statement of how the situation had been defined and what the available options consequently were. Then he put the helm over and brought the sloop's guns to bear on the approaching Jane. The broadside that Edward's men fired when the Jane came within range was the most effective single action of the engagement, tearing through the sloop's rigging, killing several men on her deck, and forcing Maynard to redirect his attention to managing the damage before it became critical. For a moment, the balance of the fight hung at a point where a different turn of wind or a slightly different disposition of forces might have produced a different outcome. But Maynard was not a man who was stopped by a broadside. He kept the Jane moving forward through the damage, closing the remaining distance with a determination that the crew matched, because they had been drilled for exactly this kind of pressure for the 3 days before leaving Keckerton. The grappling hooks went over when the Jane's hull came within reach of the sloop's rail, biting into the timber with the metallic finality of commitment. Boarding parties poured across in the following seconds. Edward met them at the quarterdeck with cutlass and pistol, fighting with the same economy of movement that had characterized everything he did at sea. No wasted motion, no theatrical display. Simply the most effective application of force available to a large, strong, experienced man who had spent decades preparing for exactly this kind of close, brutal work. He was wounded early. He continued fighting. He was wounded again and again, 5 pistol balls, 20 sword cuts in the final accounting, and continued fighting through each wound with the stubborn refusal of a man for whom surrender was not among the options he had made available to himself. The deck became what ship decks always become in close action, a small, loud, bloody world in which everything narrowed to the immediate and the personal. He fell near the quarterdeck rail as the morning light strengthened over the inlet, his long dark beard matted with blood, his pistols empty. The sloop's deck beneath him the same as it had been under his feet every morning since Bathtown. The fight lasted less than 30 minutes. The sound returned to quiet. Robert Maynard sailed north from Ocracoke Inlet on the afternoon of the 22nd of November, 1718, with the captured sloop in tow behind the Jane, the surviving members of Teach's company secured below decks, and the severed head of Edward Teach hanging from the Jane's bowsprit in the grey November air. The head had been preserved in brine against the journey north, and it served the specific practical purpose that Spotswood had always intended for this expedition proof. Visible and unambiguous, that the operation had achieved its objective, and that the man whose name had dominated colonial correspondence for the better part of 2 years was genuinely, permanently, and verifiably no longer a concern. Coastal dwellers who saw the Jane working northward along the outer banks spread word ahead of her progress, so that by the time Maynard crossed the Virginia Bar and entered the Chesapeake, the news had already reached Williamsburg through the informal network of watermen and traders who moved information along the coast with a speed that official correspondence rarely matched. Spotswood received the report with the satisfaction of a military man whose plan had been executed as designed. Arranged for the head to be displayed prominently in the colonial capital as the kind of public statement that early 18th century governance considered both appropriate and effective, and began drafting the dispatches to London that would document the action and establish the record on which his reputation as a decisive administrator would partly rest. The trials of the surviving crew members were conducted in Williamsburg under Admiralty law with the procedural briskness that characterized such proceedings in the colonial period. The men who had sailed under the articles of the Ocracoke sloop were, under the legal framework applied, pirates who had committed acts of robbery on the high seas against the subjects of the Crown, and the evidence against most of them was both abundant and uncontested. 13 were convicted and hanged in the weeks following the trial, their bodies displayed in the manner customary for pirates, gibbeted at prominent points along the waterfront, where the sight of them communicated the relevant message to anyone considering a similar career. A handful received lighter treatment on the basis of youth, evidence of coercion, or testimony that they had joined the company involuntarily from captured vessels and had not actively participated in acts of piracy. The legal distinction between willing participants and pressed men was not always clearly drawn by the evidence, and the outcomes in borderline cases reflected the discretion of the Admiralty Court rather than any consistent principle. In North Carolina, Governor Eden faced pointed questions from neighbouring colonial authorities about his pardon of Teach and his alleged involvement with the pirate community more broadly. The questions were uncomfortable but ultimately unproductive. No formal charges were brought, and Eden continued in his position until his death several years later. The controversy neither fully resolved nor entirely forgotten. The legend began its independent existence almost immediately after the events that had generated it concluded. Released prisoners from earlier captures had already established a narrative framework for Edward Teach that emphasized the theatrical elements of his appearance and operations at the expense of the more mundane organizational realities that actually explained his effectiveness. The burning beard, the smoking figure at the rail, the weapons bristling from his belt, these images circulated through every port from Boston to Bridgetown in the months following Ocracoke, amplified with each retelling by the natural human tendency to make a story more vivid than the experience it describes. In 1724, Captain Charles Johnson published in London a work titled A General History of the Robberies and Murders of the Most Notorious Pirates, which devoted substantial attention to Teach under the name Blackbeard and established in print the narrative that would shape popular understanding of the man for the following 3 centuries. Johnson drew on genuine sources' trial records, newspaper accounts, testimony from men who had encountered Teach directly, but he also drew on the accumulated embellishments that had attached themselves to the story during the years between Ocracoke and publication. The result was a portrait that was recognizably derived from the historical person while being larger, darker, and more theatrical than the evidence strictly supported. It was also, as portraits of complex people often are when drawn by skilled writers, true in its essentials even where it was inaccurate in its details. The treasure stories attached themselves to the legend with the inevitability of barnacles on an unattended hull, buried silver on the outer banks, gold hidden in the Carolina inlets, chests of coin marked with cryptic symbols waiting beneath specific trees on specific islands that only the dead man had known how to identify. These stories had no evidentiary foundation. Maynard's search of the captured sloop had found modest coin and ordinary stores, suggesting that whatever Teach had accumulated during his career had been spent in the manner that most men in his community spent their earnings, quickly and locally, on the supplies and maintenance that kept the operation running. But the absence of evidence for buried treasure has never successfully killed a buried treasure story, because the stories serve a psychological function that evidence cannot address. They keep the possibility of unexpected reward alive in the imagination of people who need it to be alive, and they attach that possibility to a specific historical figure whose name gives the fantasy a satisfying concreteness. What the historical record actually preserved was more interesting and more durable than any treasure map. The articles that governed Teach's companies, the equal shares, the compensation for injuries, the voting system. The prohibition on internal violence represented a genuine organizational innovation that produced measurable results in the specific context where they were applied. Men followed the articles because the articles worked, delivering consistent outcomes that alternative arrangements could not match. This was not romance. It was practical social engineering conducted by people whose lives depended on getting it right. And it produced a community that sustained itself for years in conditions that should, by every conventional analysis, have destroyed it within months. The long shadow that Edward Teach cast across the 3 centuries following his death at Ocracoke was built from both elements, the legend that Johnson's book crystallized and the history that the legend obscured. The burning beard and the smoking quarterdeck figure lived in one kind of memory. The methodical captain who cleaned his pistols every morning, maintained his notebook of charts and observations, enforced the articles with consistent fairness, and built loyalty through reliable performance rather than fear or charisma lived in another. Both were real. The sea that had made him was indifferent to which version survived.